Chapter 29 of The Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Myth by Alexander Berkman. Kiev. The Hrishatik, Kiev's main thoroughfare, pulsates with intense life. Straight as an arrow, it lies before me, a magnificent broad avenue, stretching far into the distance and finally disappearing in the superb Kupechisky Park, formerly the pride of the city. Ancient, the storms of time and human strife defying, Kiev stands picturesquely beautiful, a radiant mosaic of iridescent foliage, golden cathedrals and monasteries of exotic architecture, and green-clad mountains towering on the banks of the Dnieper, flowing majestically below. Recent days revived the bloody scenes the old city had witnessed in the centuries past, when Mongol and Tatar, Cossack, Pole, and fierce native tribes had fought for its possession, but more sanguinary and ferocious had been the struggles of yesterday. Foreign armies of occupation, German, Magyar, and Austrian, native Gaidamaki, Poles, Russians, each turned the ancient city into a shamble. Skoropadsky, Petlura, Denikin, like the savage atamans of Gogol's tales, have vied with each other in filling the streams that crimsoned the Dnieper in these darkest days of Russia. Incredible vitality of man, exasperating yet blessed brevity of human memory. Today, the city looks bright and peaceful. Forgotten is the slaughter, forgotten the sacrifices of yesterday. The streets, full of movement and colour, contrast strikingly with the sickly exhaustion of northern cities. Stores and restaurants are open, and the bakeries display appetizing pirozhnia, the sweets so dear to the Russian heart. Most of the business signs are still in their accustomed places, some in Russian, others in the Ukrainian language, the latter predominating since the famous decree of Skoropadsky, when overnight all shingles had to be Ukrainianized. The boulevards are alive with people, the women larger and less beautiful than in Kharkov, the men stolid, heavy, unprepossessing. It is a month since the Poles left the city. The Bolsheviki have not yet had time to establish completely their regime, but the reports of Polish destruction, so industriously circulated in Moscow, prove baseless. Little damage has been done by the enemy, except the burning of some railroad bridges on the outskirts of the city. The famous Sofisky Cathedral and the Mikhailovsky Monastery are undisturbed in their imposing splendour. Without reason did Checherin protest to the world against the unheard-of vandalism towards these gems of old architecture. The Soviet institutions present the familiar picture of Moscow pattern. Gatherings of worn, tired people, looking hungry and apathetic, typical and sad. The corridors and offices are crowded with applicants, seeking permission to do or to be exempt from doing this or that. The labyrinth of new decrees is so intricate, the officials prefer the easier way of solving perplexing problems by revolutionary method, on their conscience, generally to the dissatisfaction of the petitioners. Long lines are everywhere, and much writing and handling of papers and documents by Sovietsky barishny, young ladies, in high-heeled shoes that swarm in every office. They puff at cigarettes and animatedly discuss the advantages of certain bureaus as measured by the quantity of the pyok issued, the symbol of Soviet existence. Workers and peasants, their heads bared, approach the long tables. Respectfully, even servilely, they seek information, plead for an order for clothing or a ticket for boots. "I don't know. In the next office. Come tomorrow," is the usual reply. There are protests and lamentations, and begging for attention and advice. Occasionally, someone in the line, after days of fruitless effort, loses his temper and a string of true Russian curses fills the room, rising above the noise and the smoke. But when the commissar hastily enters, belatedly, from the conference of the party committee, the hubbub subsides, and the barishny appear busy at their tasks. He has a worn and worried look. His desk is piled with papers awaiting his attention, and within an hour he is expected at another session. Lucky applicant that gets a hearing, happy if action is taken on his case. The industries are at a low ebb, mainly because of the lack of raw material and coal. The decree militarizing labour is being applied with great severity. The toilers in the shops and factories are rigidly bound to their places of employment. But the machinery has been neglected. Most of it is out of repair, and there is a scarcity of artisans capable of putting it in order. The men are at their posts pretending to work, but in reality idling or engaged in the stealthy manufacture of cigarette lighters, keys, locks, and other objects for personal use or private sale. Many of the factories are entirely closed, others are operating with a minimum output. The sugar refineries, the most important industry of the southeast, are working at a great deficit. Because of the total devaluation of Soviet money, the state is compelled to pay its employees with products, chiefly with sugar from the old reserves. In search of documents for the museum, I gather official statistics showing that to produce 1 pood, about 40 pounds, of sugar, the government expends 35, often even 55 pounds of the old sugar. The officials realise the extreme seriousness of the situation, but feel themselves helpless. Some sceptically, others, with characteristic racial fatality, trudge on in the treadmill. In the civil and military department, there is a feverish activity, but sadly unorganised. Almost every branch is working independently, without relation to other Soviet institutions, frequently in entire ignorance and even in opposition to the policies and measures of the other executive bodies. Curious incidents result. Thus, the chairman of the All-Ukrainian Executive Committee has sent a telegraphic request to all Soviet institutions to aid the work of our expedition, while a secretary of the party has at the same time issued an order against us, condemning our mission as an attempt to deprive Ukraine of its historic documents and threatening to confiscate the material we've collected. The Soviet of Labour Unions occupies a huge building on the Hryshchatyk, which was formerly the Hotel Savoy. In 1918 and 1919, that body played a most important role, its work covering the whole field of proletarian interests, and its authority based on the expressed will of the industrial masses. But gradually, the Soviet has been deprived of power, the government taking over its essential functions, and turning the unions into executive and administrative branches of the state machinery. The elective principle has been abolished and replaced by communist appointment. The labour headquarters are in great confusion, as in Kharkiv, the entire Soviet and most of the managing boards of the locals have been recently liquidated as Menshevik or unsympathetic to the communists, and new officials appointed by Moscow. The same atmosphere of suppressed nervousness is sensed in the unions as in the other government institutions. The Bolsheviki do not feel secure in the city, and there are stubborn rumours of communist reverses on the Polish front, of Wrangel advancing from the Crimea, of Odessa being taken by the Whites, and of Makhno activity in the Kiev province. In the course of my work I come in touch with T, the Ukrainian communist, who I had met last winter in the Hartoninsky as a member of the delegation that had come to Moscow to plead for greater independence and self-determination for the Ukraine. He is of middle age, a university graduate, and revolutionist, repeatedly imprisoned under the Romanov regime. An active Borodbist, left socialist revolutionist of the Ukraine, he submitted to discipline when his party joined the communists, but he has private opinions which, long suppressed, seek relief. "I don't mind discussing these questions with you," he remarks, with an emphasis on the pronoun, "though I know that you are not a communist." "But I am," I interrupt. "Not indeed a Bolshevik nor a governmentalist, but a free anarchist communist." "Not our kind of communist." "Still, you are an old revolutionist. I heard a great deal about you in Moscow, and I can call you comrade. I disagree with you, of course, but I also disagree with the policy of my party. The Ukraine is not Russia. It's a great mistake for the centre to treat us as if we were. We could win the people to our side by having greater local autonomy and more independence. Our Ukrainian party has used every effort to convince Moscow in this matter, but without result. We are a republic in name only. In reality, we are just a Russian province. Do you want entire separation? No, we want to be federated with the RSFSR, but not subject. We are as good communists as they are in Moscow, but our influence here would be much greater were we left free to act. We know the conditions and needs of the people better than those who sit in the Kremlin. Take, for instance, the recent wholesale suspension of the union management. It has antagonized the entire labor element against us. The same is happening in the other Soviet institutions. Only yesterday a chauffeur complained to me about our Moscow methods. The man had been ordered to the front, but his wife died recently, leaving a paralytic boy on his hands. He had been trying to get his child into some hospital or home, but his petition, in the Ukrainian language, has been returned to him with the order to write it in Russian, and that after 2 weeks of waiting. Now the man is to join his regiment within 2 days. Do you wonder that the people hate us? The centre ignores our suggestions and we are powerless. Criticism of Moscow is general among the Ukrainian communists. Often, to my surprise and consternation, I detect obvious anti-Semitism in their resentment of Kremlin domination. The anecdotes and puns circulating in Soviet institutions are tinged with this spirit, though some do not lack wit. Among the people at large, hatred of the Jew is intense, though its active expression is held in abeyance, yet not infrequent are the incidents such as happened this morning in the Podol, the proletarian district of the city, where a man ran amok in the market, knife in hand, shouting, "Kill the Jews! Save Russia!" He stabbed several persons before he was overpowered. It is said that the man was crazed by hunger and illness, but his sentiments are unfortunately too popular to require such an explanation. Kiev, in the heart of the former ghetto, has lately still more increased its Hebrew population, come to the larger city in the hope of finding comparative safety from the continual wave of pogroms which swept the province since 1917. Whoever the changing political masters, with the sole exception of the Bolsheviki, the Jew was always the first victim, the eternal martyr. It is a concurrence of opinion that Denikin and the Poles were the most brutal and ruthless. Under the latter, even Kiev was not free from anti-Semitic excesses, and in the Podol, pogroms took place repeatedly. In the city library, in a recent publication by a man of great literary and intellectual attainments, I read, "Pogroms are sad, but if that is the only way to get rid of the Bolsheviki, then we must have pogroms." End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of the Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Chapter 30. In Various Walks. By the aid of R., the secretary of an important labor union, I have gathered much valuable material for the expedition. R. is a Menshevik who has in some unexplained manner escaped the recent, quote, cleaning process, unquote. His known popularity among the workers, he believes, has saved him. "The Bolsheviki are keeping an eye on me, but they have left me alone so far," he said significantly. Familiar with the city, its museums, libraries, and archives, R. has been a great help in my quest for data and documents. Much that is valuable has been lost, and still more has been destroyed by the workers themselves in the interests of their safety at the time of German occupation and White Terror. But a considerable part of the labor archives has been preserved, sufficient to reconstruct the history of the heroic struggle of the unions since their inception and throughout the stormy days of revolution and civil war. All through, the Mensheviki played the role of the intellectual leaders, with the Bolsheviki and the anarchists as the revolutionary inspiration of the workers. The headquarters of the Labor Soviet have somehow become the depository of a strange documentary mixture. Police and gendarme records, the minutes of Duma sessions, and financial statistics have found their way there, only to be forgotten. By a curious chance, the first Universal of Petlura, a rare document containing the original Declaration of Principles and Aims by the Ukrainian National Democracy, has been discovered by me in a neglected drawer. A communist official claims it as his, quote, personal possession, unquote, with which, however, he is willing to part for a consideration. In view of the large price demanded, the matter has now become a subject of correspondence with the museum. In Menshevik circles, feeling against the Bolsheviki is very bitter. It is the general sentiment among them that the communists, formerly Social Democrats, have betrayed Marx and discredited socialism. Asiatic revolutionists, R. calls them. There is no difference between Trotsky and the hangman Stolypin, he asserts. Their methods are identical. Indeed, there was more political life under Nicholas II than there is today. The Bolsheviki, alleged Marxists, think by decrees and terror to alter the immutable law of social evolution, to skip several steps at once, as it were, on the ladder of progress. The February Revolution was essentially bourgeois, but Lenin attempted to turn it by the violence of an insignificant minority into a social revolution. The complete debacle of all hopes is the result. The communists, R. believes, cannot last much longer. Russia is on the verge of utter economic collapse. The old food reserves are exhausted, production has almost ceased, militarization of toil has failed. Trotsky's calculations of the progressive increase of the output on the labor front have been exploded, like Bolshevik prophecies of world revolution. The factory is not a battlefield. Converting the country into a camp of forced labor is not conducive to creative effort. It has divided the people into slaves and slave drivers, and created a powerful class of Soviet bureaucrats. Most significant of all, it has turned even the more advanced workers against the communists. Now the Bolsheviki can count neither on the peasant nor on the proletariat. The whole country is against them. But for the stupid policy of the Allies, they would have been swept away long ago. The blockade and invasions have played into their hands. The Bolsheviki need war to keep them in power. The present Polish campaign suits them splendidly. But it is the last communist straw. It will break, and the bloody Bolshevik experiment will come to an end. History will write them down as the arch-enemies of the revolution, R concluded emphatically. Friday evening. On the dining table at the home of Reb Zachary, the old Zionist, burn 3 candles orthodoxically blessed by the housewife. The whole family are gathered for the festive occasion, but the traditional soup and meat are absent. Herring and kasha are being served, and small chunks of kale, the Sabbath bread, now only partly of wheat. Besides the parents, 2 daughters and a son of 18 are present. The oldest boy, Yankel was his name, Reb Zachary says with a heavy sigh, he'd now be 23, his memory be blessed, was killed in the pogrom the Denikin men had made just before they finally evacuated the city. He sought to defend his sister, the youngest, then only 15. Together they were visiting a friend in the Podol when the mob broke into the street, sacking every house, pillaging and murdering. The old lady sits in the corner, crying quietly. The look of frozen terror, which I have seen often lately, is in the eyes of the girls. The young man steps over to his mother and gently speaks to her. True Zionists, the family converse in Old Hebrew, making an evident concession in addressing me in Yiddish. At least you are free from pogroms under the Bolsheviki, I remark. In a certain sense, the old man assents. But it is the Bolsheviki who are responsible for pogroms. Yes, we had them under the Tsar also, he interrupts my protest, but they were nothing like those we have had since. Hatred against us has increased. To the Gentiles, a Bolshevik now means a Jew. A commissar is a Zid, appropriate term for the Jew, and every Hebrew is held responsible for the murders of the Tcheka. I have lived all my life in the ghetto, and I have seen pogroms in the years past, but never such terrible things as since the Bolsheviki got into Moscow. But they have made no pogroms, I insist. They also hate the Jew. We are always the victims. Under the communists, we have no violent mob pogroms, at least I have not heard of any, but we have the quiet pogroms, the systematic destruction of all that is dearest to us, of our traditions, customs, and culture. They are killing us as a nation. I don't know but what that is the worst pogrom, he adds bitterly. After a while he takes up the subject again. Some foolish Jews are proud that our people are in the government, and that Trotsky is war minister. As if Trotsky and such others are Jews. What good is it all, I ask, when our nation must suffer as before and more? The Jews have been made the political and social equals of Gentiles, I suggest. Equals in what? In misery and corruption. But even there we are not equal. The Jew has more to bear than the others. We are not fit for the factory. We were always businessmen, traders, and now we have been ruined entirely. They have sown corruption in our youth, who now think only of power, or to join the Tcheka for gain. That was never before. They are destroying the dream of Palestine, our true home. They are suppressing every effort to educate our children in the proper Jewish spirit. In the Kulturliga gather Hebrew writers, poets, and teachers, most of them members of the Volkspartei when that political party was represented in the Rada by its Minister of Jewish Affairs. Formerly the League was a powerful organization, with 230 branches throughout the South, doing cultural work among its co-religionists. The institution had much to suffer through the various political changes. The Bolsheviki were tolerant at first, and even financially aided its educational efforts. But gradually the help was withdrawn, and obstacles began to be placed in the way of the League. The Communists frown upon the too nationalistic character of its work. The Yovkom, Jewish branch of the party, is particularly antagonistic. The League's teachers and older pupils have been mobilized into state service, and the field of its efforts narrowed down. In the provinces, most of its branches have been compelled to close entirely, but in Kiev, the devotion and persistence of its leading spirits still enables the League to continue. It is the sole oasis in the city of non-partisan intellectual and social life. Though now limited in its activities, it still enjoys great popularity among the Jewish youth. Its art classes, including drawing, painting, and sculpture, are eagerly visited, and the theatrical studio is developing young actors and actresses of much promise. The rehearsals I attended especially that of The World's End, the posthumous work of an unknown dramatist, were unique in artistic conception and powerful in expression. The younger elements that frequent the Kulturliga dream of Zion and look to the aid of England in securing to the Jewish nation its traditional home. They are out of touch with the Western world and recent events, but their reliance on the hopes raised by the Jewish Congress is unshaken. Somehow, sometime, probably even in the not-distant future, is to happen the great event, and Jewry will be re-established in Palestine. In that ardent faith, they drag on their existence from day to day, intellectually vegetating, physically in misery. Their former sources of support are abolished, the government having supplied them with a bread card of the fourth category. The latter is the Bolshevik label of the bourgeoisie, the intelligentsia now being denounced as such, though in reality the rich middle class has sought safety at the outbreak of the revolution. Hatred of the bourgeoisie has been transferred to the intellectuals, official agitation cultivating and intensifying this spirit. They are represented as the enemies of the proletariat, traitors to the revolution, at best speculators, if not active counter-revolutionists. There is no stemming the fearful tide sweeping against them, nor is it the spontaneous unfettering of popular sentiment. The flames are fanned by Moscow. Bolshevik agents from the center, sent as chiefs and instructors, systematically rouse the basest instincts. Zinoviev himself severely upbraided the local communists and his brother proletarians for leniency to the bourgeoisie. "They still walk your streets," he exclaimed at a public meeting, "clad in the best finery, while you go about in rags. They live in the luxurious homes, while you grovel in cellars. You must not permit such things any longer." Visits of communist leaders are always followed by renewed, quote, "requisitions from the bourgeoisie," unquote. The method is simple. The house porter is instructed to compile a list of holders of cards of the fourth category. In most cases, they are intellectual proletarians, teachers, writers, scientists. But the possession of the fourth category card is their doom. They are legitimate victims of requisition. Clothing, underwear, household goods, everything is confiscated as alleged izlishki, superfluities. "The most tragic part of it," said C., the well-known Yiddish writer, "is that the izlishki rarely reach their proletarian destination. We all know that the really valuable things confiscated get no further than the Tcheka, while the old and almost useless rags are sent to the unions for distribution among the workers." "Often one does not even know who is requisitioning," remarked a member of the League. "Sometimes it is done by Chekists on their own account." "Is there no redress?" I asked. "Does no one protest?" C. made a deprecating motion. "We have learned better," he replied, "from the fate of those who dared." "You can't protest against Bolshevik revolutionary orders, as they call it," said a young woman teacher. "I have tried it. It happened like this. One day, returning to my room, I found a stranger occupying it. On my demanding what he was doing there, he informed me that he had been assigned to it, showing me his document from the Housing Bureau. 'And what shall I do?' I asked. 'You can sleep on the floor,' he replied, stretching himself on my bed. I protested to the higher authorities, but they refused to consider the matter. 'The room is big enough for two,' they insisted, though that was not the case at all. 'But you put a strange man in my room,' I pleaded. 'You'll soon get acquainted,' they sneered. 'We make no distinction of sex.' I remained with some friends for a while, but they were so crowded I had to look for other quarters. For days I stood in line in the Housing Bureau, but it was impossible to get an order for a room. Meanwhile, my chief threatened to report me for neglecting my work, because most of my time was spent in the Soviet offices. Finally, I complained to the Rabkrin, which is supposed to protect proletarian interests. Their agent invited me to share his room, and I slapped his face. He had me arrested, and I was kept in the Tcheka 2 months for sabotage." "It might have ended worse," someone commented. "When you were released," I pursued, interested in the woman's story, "what did you do about your room?" She smiled sadly. "I learned a lot while sitting in the Tcheka," she said. "When I was liberated, I sought out a member of the Housing Bureau. Fortunately, I had saved a pair of fine French shoes, and I presented them to him. 'A little gift for your wife,' I told him, not much caring which one would get it, for he is known to have several. Within 24 hours, I received a splendid large room, furnished in true bourgeois style." The sun has set, the streets are dark, the infrequent lights flicker dimly in the foggy air. Turning the corner of the Kronstadt, on my way to the Ispolkom, I find myself in the midst of an excited crowd, surrounded by soldiers and militia. It is an oblava looking for labor deserters. Men and women are detained within the military circle to be taken to the station for examination. Only a communist card secures immediate release. Arrest means detention for days, even weeks, and I have an urgent appointment at communist headquarters. But in vain I explain to the militsionary that Tovarich Vitoshkin is expecting me. Even the name of the powerful head of the executive committee does not impress them. The Committee of Labor and Defense is now supreme. Its orders are to detain everyone for investigation regarding his employment. The arrested men and women plead, argue, and produce documents, but the soldiers remain stolid, commanding everyone to line up. I demand to see the officer in charge, but the militsionaire remains at my side, ignoring my protests. Suddenly the crowd in front begins jostling and pushing. A fight has started on the corner. My guard rushes forward, and, taking advantage of the situation, I cross the street and step into the Ispolkom building. Yatoshkin's secretary meets me on the stairs. Excusing my tardiness by the Oblava incident, I suggest the desirability of better system and judgment in the organization of such matters. The secretary expresses regret at the stupid and irresponsible manner of the raid, but nichevo ne podaliesh, it can't be helped, he assures me with conviction. The communist banquet hall is flooded with light. The walls are decorated with red banners and inscriptions, and crimson bunting frames the large portraits of Lenin and Trotsky, with a small likeness of Lunacharsky in a less conspicuous place. The long dining table is laden with a variety of fruit and wine, and a choice meal is served to the guests invited to honor the French and Italian delegates visiting the city. Angelika Balabanova is presiding. At her side are Vitoshkin and other high Soviet officials of the city, with a large sprinkling of men in military uniform. It is an official assembly of the communist aristocracy, with Emma Goldman and myself as the only non-Bolsheviki present by special invitation of our mutual friend Angelika. Her motherly, simple personality seems out of place in this gathering. There is deep sadness in her look, a suggestion of disapproval of all the finery and style put on for the occasion. Her attention is engaged by the local men at her side, who exert themselves to please the important personage, quote, from the center, unquote. Others are entertaining the foreign delegates, the French-speaking tovarishchi having been placed as their neighbors. The wine is good and unstinted, the food delicious. By degrees the atmosphere loses its stiff formality, and a freer spirit descends upon the banquet table. With coffee begin the speeches. The Russian proletariat, with the Communist Party as its advance guard, is extolled as the banner-bearer of social revolution, and the firm conviction of the speedy breakdown of capitalism throughout the world is expressed. But for the cursed allies starving the country and supporting armed counter-revolution, Russia, it is claimed, would be a workers' paradise with full liberty and welfare for all. The Mensheviki and the social revolutionists, traitors to the revolution, have been silenced within the country, but abroad these lackeys of capitalism, the Kautskys, Lafargues et al., still continue their poisonous work, maligning the communists and defaming the revolution. It is therefore doubly to be welcomed that the foreign delegates have come to Russia to acquaint themselves with the real situation, and that they are visiting the Ukraina, where they can with their own eyes witness the great work the communists have accomplished. I glance at the delegates. They sit unmoved during the long speeches in the strange language, but even Angelika's masterful rendering into French, enriched by her personality and impassioned oratory, does not seem to impress them. I detect disappointment in their faces. Perhaps they had hoped for a less official, more intimate discussion of the revolutionary problems. They have undoubtedly heard of the numerous peasant uprisings and the punitive expeditions, the frequent strikes, the Makhno movement, and the general opposition to the communists. But these matters have been carefully avoided by the speakers, who have sought to present a picture of a unified people cooperating in the, quote, proletarian dictatorship, unquote, and enthusiastically supporting its, quote, advance guard, the Communist Party, unquote. Late at night, accompanying the foreign delegates to the railroad station, I have opportunity to learn their sentiments. The observations we have made while in Russia and the material we have collected, one of them remarks, entirely disprove Bolshevik claims. We feel it our duty to tell the whole truth to our people at home. Next morning, in the passage, where provisions are purchased to fill out the scanty pyok, I meet little knots of people lamenting and crying. Nothing is being sold. The little bakery and fruit stores were visited by the authorities the previous evening, and all their goods requisitioned. Deep gloom hangs over the traders and their customers. With a sense of outrage, they point to the large delicatessen stores on the Kronstadt which have not been molested. "They have protection," someone says indignantly. My God, a woman cries. "It's we poor people who gave that banquet to the delegates." She was introduced to me as Galina, a young woman in peasant dress, but of graceful figure, and with thoughtful blue eyes. Galina, I wondered. Yes, Makhno's wife. Surprise and fear for her safety struggled with my admiration of her courage. Her presence in Kiev, in the very lair of the Tcheka, means certain death were she to be recognized. Yet she has braved imminent peril and great difficulties in crossing the front. She has business in the city for the povstanci, she said. She has also brought a message from Nestor. He is very anxious to have Emma Goldman and myself visit him. He is not far from the city, and arrangements could be made to enable us to see him. Her manner was reserved, almost shy, but she was very positive in her views, and her expression clear and definite. She looked so frail and alone, I was overwhelmingly conscious of the great danger to which she was exposing herself. She gave me the feeling of a diminutive David rising up to smite Goliath. "I'm not afraid," she said simply. "You know, I usually accompany Nestor, and he is always at the head of his men," she added with quiet pride. She spoke with much warmth of Makhno's military ability, his great popularity among the peasantry, and the success of his campaigns against Denikin, but she is not uncritical, nor a blind hero-worshipper. On the contrary, she dwelt much more on the significance and purpose of the rebel peasant movement than on the role of its individual leaders. In the Makhnovщina, she sees the hope of Russia's liberation from the yoke of white generals, pomestchiki, landlords, and Bolshevik commissarship. The one is as hateful to her as the other, both equally subversive of liberty and the revolution. "I regard the povstanci movement," she said, "as the only true proletarian revolution. Bolshevism is the mastery of the Communist Party, falsely called the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is very far from our conception of revolution. It is the rulership of a caste, of the socialist intelligentsia, which has imposed its theories upon the toilers. Their aim is state communism, with the workers and farmers of the whole country serving as employees of the one powerful government master. Its result is the most abject slavery, suppression, and revolt, as we see on every hand. But the people themselves, the proletarians of city and country, have an entirely different ideal, even though, to a great extent, only instinctive. They ignore all parties, and are antagonistic to the political intellectuals. They distrust the non-working, privileged elements. Our aim is the class organization of the revolutionary toiling masses. That is the sense of the great Ukrainian movement, and its best expression is to be found in the Makhnovщina. Without the help of government or political parties, the peasants drove away the landlords. By their own efforts they secured the land. Their military units have successfully fought every counter-revolutionary force. The Bolsheviki, with their Red Army, usually came into the already freed district, there to impose their mastery upon city and country and proclaim their dictatorship. Is it any wonder the people hate them and fight them as bitterly as the whites? She is a typical specimen of the rebel Ukrainian, of the type molded in the crucible of hard revolutionary life. All night we talked of the burning problems of the South, of the needs of the peasantry, and the activities of the povstanci, whose beloved and almost venerated leader is Batka Makhno, the Stenka Razin of the revolution. She related stories of the great devotion of the peasantry to Nestor, and told interesting anecdotes of his campaigns. Once, when Makhno with a small company found himself surrounded by a large Bolshevik force, he caused a marriage to be performed in the village occupied by the enemy. Makhno's men, in borrowed holiday attire, attended the celebration, their famous sawed-off guns hidden upon their bodies. In the midst of the carousal, the Red soldiers, the worse for the liquor freely supplied by the villagers, the pretended holiday-makers, opened fire, taking the Bolshevik garrison by surprise and putting them to flight. The very mention of Makhno's name, Galina said, brings terror to the enemy, and frequently whole companies of the Red Army join his forces. Commissars and communists, identical terms to the povstanci, find no mercy, but the common soldier is always given the choice of remaining with him or going free. That was the case also, she continued in her melodious voice, with Grigoriev's army. You have heard of him, haven't you, comrade? He was an officer of the Tsar, but at the outbreak of the revolution he became a freelance. At one time he was with Petlura, then he fought him, and later he joined the Red Army. He was just a military adventurer, though not without some ability. He was very vain, loving to style himself the Ataman of Khersontine, because his greatest successes were in that province. Later he turned against the Bolsheviki and invited Makhno to make common cause with him, but Nestor found out that Grigoriev was planning to join Denikin. Besides, he was guilty of many pogroms. The slaughter of Jews he organized in Yekaterinoslav in May of last year, 1919, was especially atrocious. Makhno decided to eliminate him. He called a meeting to which the Ataman and his men were invited. It was a large gathering at which 20,000 peasants and povstanci were present. Footnote. Took place in the village of Sentovo, Kherson Province, July 27, 1919. End of footnote. Nestor publicly accused Grigoriev of counter-revolutionary designs, charged him with pogroms, and denounced him as an enemy of the people. The Ataman and his staff were executed on the spot. Almost his whole force joined our povstanci. Galina spoke of executions in an even, ordinary tone, as of matters of common occurrence. Life in the Ukraina among the rebel peasantry had made constant struggle and violence the habitual tenor of her existence. Occasionally she would slightly raise her voice in indignation when reports of Jew-baiting by povstanci were mentioned. She felt deeply outraged by such base misrepresentation. These stories were deliberately spread by the Bolsheviki, she averred. No one could be more severe in punishing such excesses than Nestor. Some of his best comrades are Jews. There are a number of them in the Revolutionary Soviet and in other branches of the army. Few men are so loved and respected by the povstanci as Yosef the emigrant, who is a Jew and Makhno's best friend. We are not such barbarians as we are painted, she said with a charming smile. But you will learn more about us when you visit us, which will not be far off, I hope. She listened wistfully to the news from the Western world, and plied me with questions about life in America and the attitude of its workers to Russia. The role of women on the other side was of intense interest to her, and she was eager to procure books dealing at length with the subject. She looked dejected on learning that almost nothing was known in the States about the Ukrainian peasant movement, but she recovered quickly, remarking, "Naturally, for we are so isolated, but some day they will know." The night had turned to dawn, and all too quickly the morning was breaking. It was high time for Galina to be on her way. Regretfully she left us, expressing her confidence in our speedy meeting in the camp of Makhno. In complete self-possession she stepped out of the house, while with bated breath we accompanied her at a distance, fearful lest a chance identification result fatally for the daring girl. End of Chapter 30. Read by Eli Bishop, San Francisco, February 10th, 2022.
Chapter 31 of the Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mr. Rourke 865. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Chapter 31. The Tcheka. A pall hangs over the home of my friend Kolya, the tailor. His wife is ill. The children neglected, dirty, and hungry. The plumbing is out of order, and water must be carried from the next street 4 flights up. Kolya always performed the heavy work. His absence falls heavily on the little family. From time to time the neighbors look in on the sick woman. "Your husband will soon return," they assure her cheerfully. But I know that all their efforts to find him have proved fruitless. Kolya is in the Tcheka. The workers of the clothing factory where my friend is employed have of late been very discontented. Their main complaint concerns the arbitrary methods of the Yatchieka, the little group of communists within every Soviet institution. Friction between them and the shop committee resulted in the arrest of the latter. In protest, the workers declared a strike. 3 delegates were sent to the Tcheka with the request to release the prisoners, but the men disappeared, and Kolya was among them. "They call the strikers counter-revolutionists," Kolya's sister said. They have made a list of the opposition in the shop, and every day someone is missing. It's the old Pierrot methods, remarked a neighbor, a young woman in charge of a children's dining room. Pierrot methods? I asked in surprise. Don't you know the Pierrot affair? It was of a piece with the usual methods of Latsis, then head of the All-Ukrainian Extraordinary Commission. It was in the summer of 1919, and the Kiev Tcheka was working, that's right, just the proper word, interrupted her brother. Yes, working, under high pressure, she continued, under instructions of Peters, who came from Moscow now and then. His presence in the city was always the signal for renewed arrests and shooting. Well, one day the Soviet papers announced the arrival of Count Pierrot, Brazilian ambassador. I was, at the time, employed in the Chinese consulate, which gave a gala dinner in honor of the Count, on which occasion I made his acquaintance. I was surprised to find the Brazilian speaking excellent Russian, but he explained that he had spent many years in our country before the revolution. He sighed over the old days, and did not in the least disguise his unfriendliness to Bolshevism and its methods. Within a few days he began to organize his staff on a large scale. He asked me and my friends to recommend people for work in his consulate. "Except Bolsheviki," he said. "I want only bourgeois and intellectuals who have no sympathy with the communists. They'll be safe with me," he told us in confidence, hinting at the wholesale destruction of the intelligentsia by the Tcheka. Many hastened to offer their services to the Count, eager for the protection offered. Pierrot accepted them all, placing some in his offices, while others were put on the waiting list, and their names and addresses recorded. To be brief, within a short time they were all arrested, and most of them shot. Among them Mademoiselle Popladskaya, Pierrot's personal secretary, whom he was pretending to help join her husband in Paris. Pierrot disappeared, but he was seen to leave town in Peter's automobile. It soon became known that the alleged Brazilian count was an agent of the Tcheka, a provocateur. Many people in Kiev are positive that it was Peters himself. I related to my friend an incident which occurred soon after our expedition arrived in the city. Early one morning a visitor called at our car, requesting to see the Présidatel. Of commanding stature, well-proportioned, and straight as a young pine, he was a fine specimen of physical manhood. He had just returned from the front, he said, as if in explanation of his ridiculously belligerent appearance. 2 heavy guns hung from his belt, a Circassian dagger between them. At his side he carried a long sword, and a huge alarm whistle, set in silver, was suspended from his neck. His features were clean-cut, nose aquiline, the sensuous lips somewhat shaded by a full beard. But the most striking feature were his eyes, the color of steel, cold, sharp, and piercing. He introduced himself as an army man who had fought on every battlefield in the Ukraine, but he was tired of war and bloodshed, he said. He wanted a rest, or at least a more peaceful occupation. The work of our expedition appealed to him. Could he not be of service to us? Surely a large city like Kiev could not be thoroughly canvassed during our short stay. He would therefore suggest that we appoint a local man as our representative to continue the work after our expedition should leave. He would consider himself honored to aid our important mission. There was nothing unusual in his proposal, since it is our practice to leave an authorized person in the larger cities to supply the museum with documents of current history. We promised to consider his application, and within a few days he called again. I thought he looked strangely animated, perhaps even under the influence of drink. He immediately launched into exaggerated assurances of his fitness as our collaborator. He knew every important communist in the city, he asserted. He was even on terms of intimacy with most of them. The previous night, he declared, he had spent in the company of high-placed commissars, among whom was also the chief of the Tcheka. With that he began a recital of its activities, relating revolting details of torture and execution. He spoke with increasing fervor and growing excitement. At last he announced himself a commandant. He had shot many counter-revolutionists, he boasted, and he had never felt any qualms about his work. His eyes gleamed with a fierce, savage fire, and suddenly he drew the dagger from his belt. Leaning over close to me and wildly waving the weapon, he cried, "Look at it! It's bloody to the hilt!" Then he fell back into a chair, exhausted, and with a touch of sentimentality he muttered, "I've had enough. I'm tired. I want to rest." "To judge from your description," remarked the young woman, "it must have been X, one of the most notorious executioners of the provincial Tcheka. He is given to such escapades, especially when under the influence of drugs, for he is addicted to cocaine. One of his hobbies is to get himself photographed, like this." She rose, searched a moment among her effects, and handed me a small picture. It represented a man entirely nude, gun in hand, in the posture of taking deliberate aim. I recognized our visitor. August 27th, 1920. Rumors of Bolshevik reverses are delaying our departure. There are persistent reports of Red Army defeats. Odessa is said to be evacuating, an enemy fleet in the Black Sea attacking the city, and Wrangel marching against it from the Crimea. Nothing definite is to be ascertained in the general confusion, but from authoritative circles we have learned that Red forces are being concentrated in the vicinity. The new developments, Joseph has informed me, compelled Makhno to retire from the province. To my great regret, our plan of meeting the Povstanci leader becomes impracticable for the present. With much anxiety, I think of Galina and her safety in the new turn of affairs. Our expedition faces the alternative of returning to Moscow or proceeding further south. In spite of insistent advice to the contrary, we decide to continue according to our schedule, which includes Odessa and the Caucasus. End of Chapter 31. Read by Mr. Rourke, 865.
Chapter 32 of The Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Chapter 32, Odessa, Life and Vision. September 2nd, 1920. Late yesterday afternoon, we reached Odessa, our little commune greatly disturbed over the fate of Augsburg. Our traveling companion, whose cheerful spirit and ready helpfulness contributed so much toward making our journey more pleasant, was arrested on August 30th while we were stopping in Zhmerinka. The local Tcheka agents had received orders from Moscow to, quote, return the American correspondent, unquote, because he had gone to the Ukraina without the knowledge of the authorities. In vain we argued, and produced Zinovьev's letter giving Augsburg permission to join the expedition. He was removed from the train to be taken under convoy to Moscow. The wires we sent to Lenin, Zinoviev, and Balabanova, protesting against the arrest and urging the release of our friend, have so far remained unanswered. The great city, formerly the most important shipping center of the country, was shrouded in darkness, its electric supply station having been almost completely destroyed by fire several days previously. With considerable difficulty, we found our way to one of the principal thoroughfares. On the corner, we were detained by a militionnaire who informed us that it is forbidden to be about after sunset except by special permission. It required considerable persuasion before the officer was convinced of our reliability and permitted us to return to the car. Our first impressions seemed to justify the disconcerting reports we had heard en route. No more cheerful is the once beautiful city in the glow of the bright morning sun. Few persons are on the streets. The houses and parks are neglected, the pavements broken and filthy. Everywhere is evidence of the poverty and suffering in the wake of foreign occupation and civil war. Food is very scarce, prices exorbitantly high on the markets which are still permitted to operate. The peasants of the district, systematically expropriated by their changing masters, now refuse to plant more than is necessary for their own needs, leaving the cities to their fate. Externally, Odessa is quiet, and there is no sign of enemy warships in the harbor. But an atmosphere of anxious suspense is felt everywhere. Bands of Green and Makhno forces are said to be in the neighborhood, and Wrangel is reported to have taken some villages northeast in the vicinity of Rostov. A spirit of qui vive pervades the Soviet bureaus, everyone wearing a preoccupied air, as if listening for the first note of alarm and ready to take flight. Much disorganization prevails in the unions. the new communist management has not yet gained full control over the liquidated Menshevik and anarchist leadership. Many of the latter are still at the head of labor affairs, persistently elected by the workers in open defiance of communist orders. Among the opposition, Shakvorostov, an anarchist and militant type, has such a strong following that the Bolsheviki have not dared to remove him. Due to his friendly efforts, the Soviet of Unions has decided to call a meeting of secretaries, whom I am to address in the interest of the museum. The non-partisan proletarians, who constitute the great body of labor, look with scorn at the readiness of the communists to flee should an enemy appear. Particularly the sailors of the destroyed Black Sea Fleet, many of whom are in the city, resent the situation. The masses cannot evacuate, they say. The workers are doomed to remain, whoever comes, and to fight it out as best they can. Have not the unions, aided by the peasantry, waged successful guerrilla warfare against the Greek and Italian forces and the white generals? Then there was no distinction of political party. All revolutionists fought side by side. But every time the enemy is driven out, the communists institute their dictatorship, seek to dominate the Revolutionary Committee in charge of the safety of the city, and eliminate the old and tried fighters. The masses know how to protect themselves against invaders, but they resent the domination of a political party that seeks to monopolize the revolution. Semyon Petrovich, at whose home I spend considerable time, is an intelligent nonpartisan of independent views. An able statistician, he has been permitted by the Bolsheviki to remain in the Department of Economy, where he had served under previous regimes. Semyon is convinced that the Soviet government will find itself compelled to change its methods and practices. The ravager cannot long remain in the country he has ravaged, he likes to repeat the alleged saying of Denikin. But the ire of the gods, he asserts, pursues the Bolsheviki. Even their best intentions serve in practice to confound them. They have closed the stores and abolished private trade, Semyon Petrovich repeats. They have nationalized, registered, and taken an invoice of everything under the sun. One would think that complete order should reign. Indeed, you cannot transfer a bed mattress from one apartment into another without special permission of the proper authorities. If you want to ride to the next station, you must get an order. If you need a sheet of paper, you have to fill several sheets with applications. Every detail of our existence has become subject to Bolshevist regulation. In short, you will find the situation in Odessa about the same as in the rest of Russia, Semyon assured me. But life passes by the Soviet apparatus, because life is incomparably stronger than any attempts at doctrinaire regulation. As in other Soviet cities, the population is supplied with a bread and products card. But except communists, very few receive enough bread to exist. On the bourgeois categories, none has been issued for months. In fact, since the Bolsheviki took Odessa in January. Occasionally, a little salt, sugar, and matches are rationed out. Fortunately, the markets are still permitted to exist, Semyon explained. The government cannot press out enough bread of the farmers to feed the cities. The piyok is mostly a vision. That reminds me of a certain commissar in our department, a rare type of communist, for he has a sense of humor. Once I asked him why the Bolsheviki nationalized everything except the izvozchiki, cabmen. His reply was characteristic. You see, he said, we found that if you don't feed human beings, they continue to live somehow. But if you don't feed horses, the stupid beasts die. That's why we don't nationalize the cabmen. Life is indeed stronger than decrees. It sprouts through every crevice of the socialist armor. When private trade was forbidden and only the cooperatives were permitted to continue, all business places suddenly became inspired by feelings of altruism, and every store was decorated with the sign of the EPO, cooperative. Later, when the cooperatives were also closed, and only kustarnyi, small-scale, production remained legal, all the little stores began manufacturing cigarette lighters and rubber soles from stolen automobile tires. Subsequently, new decrees were issued permitting trade only in articles of food. Then, in every store window there appeared bread and tea surrogates, while other wares were sold in the rear rooms. Finally, all food stores were closed. Now the illicit trade is transferred to the storekeeper's home, and business is done on the back stairs. The Bolsheviki want to abolish private trade and destroy speculation, Semyon remarked. They want everyone to live exclusively by his labor. Yet in no place in the world is there so much speculation as in Russia. The whole country is swept by its fever. Nationalization of trade means that the whole nation is in trade, our wits say. The truth is, we have all become speculators, he continued sadly. Every family now depends more on the sale of its table and bed linen than on the salaries paid by the Soviet government. The shopkeepers, having lost their shops, still remain traders, and they are now joined by those who formerly were workers, physical as well as intellectual. Necessity is stronger than laws, my dear friend. The real factory proletarians have become declassified. They have ceased to exist as a class because most of the factories and mills are not working. The workers flee into the country or become meshachniki, bagmen, traders. The communist dictatorship has destroyed, but it cannot build up. At the house of Dr. L., almost nightly, gather little groups of the local intelligentsia. A man of broad culture and tolerance, L's home is neutral ground for the most diverse political tendencies. His private sanatorium, beautifully situated on an embankment washed by the Black Sea, was formerly famed as one of the best in Odessa. It has been nationalized, but the physician and his staff are exempt from professional mobilization and remain in charge. Dr. L. is still permitted to receive a certain number of private patients, which privilege enables him to support himself and family in comparative comfort. In return, he is obliged to treat without remuneration the sick assigned to the sanatorium by the authorities. L. and his wife, herself a graduate physician, are hospitable in the best Russian spirit. Though their present mode of living is far below that of former days, every comer finds a warm welcome, which includes an invitation to the dining room, a custom now almost entirely fallen into disuse in Russia. With charming smile and graceful gesture, Madame L. passes around tea, little lumps of yellow candy homemade from beet sugar, and sandwiches, her manner quite innocent of any suggestion of the saving quality of her service to her famished guests. The sanatorium was requisitioned for the benefit of the proletariat, the doctor informs me with a humorous twinkle in his eyes, but it is occupied exclusively by high communist officials and several members of the Tcheka. Among the latter is also a commissar, who has repeatedly taken treatment in the institution. He suffers from acute neurosis and is an habitual user of cocaine. In spite of the near presence of the dreadful autocrat of life and death, great freedom of speech prevails in L's home. It is the tacit understanding among his guests that the place is a free forum, a, quote, sanctuary for the crime of thought, unquote. Yet, I notice that when a communist happens to be present, expression is less spontaneous, more controlled. I recall the arrest of the frequenters of a similar oasis in Moscow, betrayed by a member of the family, a Bolshevik. Might not such a misfortune also happen here? Yet Dr. G., the Menshevik colleague of the host, is most outspoken against the Bolsheviki, whom he holds up to ridicule as counterfeit Marxists. The Zionists and literati present, among them Bialik, the greatest living Jewish poet, are more temperate in their criticism of the dictatorship. Their attitude is prompted by their love of the Jewry and its aspirations as a nation. They tell of the many vain efforts their most venerated representatives have made in the interests of justice to their co-religionists, only to be met with scorn and insult. R., the noted Hebrew author, relates the incident of his visit to the chief of the Tcheka to seek protection for two friends unjustly accused of speculation and in danger of being shot. In the reception room, while awaiting audience with the Predsedatel, he was abused by the Chekists, among whom he recognized several members of the old police force and two well-known criminals of former days. "You are insulting the Soviet power by interceding for the arrested," the Tcheka chief told him. The author urged the innocence of the accused. "If you plead for speculators, you are no better than they," the chief reported. Both men were executed without trial. Through an open window, I look out upon the broad expanse of the Black Sea below. It is a quiet, moonlit night. The low murmur of the waters pleasantly strikes upon the ear, as the white-capped waves with musical regularity reach the shore, softly splash against the rocks, and silently recede. They return to caress the sentinel wall that seems to draw closer toward them, as if yearning for their embrace. A gentle breeze floats into the room. Angry voices recall me to the company. The young Bundist D. Footnote, Der Bund, an organization of Jewish socialists, end footnote, is involved in a virulent dispute with his former comrade turned communist. D. charges the Bolsheviki with having stooped to a partnership with the notorious Odessa criminals, who were organized into regiments and possessed weapons and machine guns. They had first helped Ataman Grigoriev to take the city, and were later used by the communists for the same purpose. Indebted to the thieves, the Bolsheviki did not molest them in the first days of their Odessa regime, and the, quote, professional union, unquote, was permitted to work the city. Subsequently, the Soviet government declared war upon them, but the leading spirits saved their lives by joining the Tcheka. The communist vehemently denies that any agreement had existed between his party and the criminals, though he admits that in some instances the thieves' union aided the work of the Bolsheviki. The argument is becoming dangerously heated. Madame I, grown apprehensive, holds up a warning hand. "Friends, tovarishchi," she cautions them, "please not so loud." "Do not worry," the host laughs. "It's the usual thing when these two come together. They're old friends, relatives at that, for the ex-Bundist married the Bundist's sister." "It is an open question," observes Z, the literary investigator, "whether the Bolsheviki had a formal agreement with the thieves, but that they cooperated at one time is known to all of us. Well, they were also proletarians," he added sarcastically. "Later, of course, the communists turned against them. But a similar fate has befallen most of us. The left SRS, the Maximalists, the anarchists, did they not all fight together with the communists against the whites? And where are they now? Those who did not die on the fronts have been shot or imprisoned by the red dictators, unless they have been bribed or cowed into serving the Tcheka." "Only weaklings would save their lives thus," the hostess protests. "Few can be brave with a loaded gun pointed at their temple," the doctor remarks with a sigh. It is a cold, chilly day as I turn my steps toward Sadovaya Street. There, at a secret session, is to take place a Menshevik Kostnaya Gazeta, oral newspaper, and I am to meet prominent members of the party. The oral newspaper is the modern Russian surrogate for a free press. Deprived of opportunity to issue their publications, the suppressed socialist and revolutionary elements resort to this method. In some private dwelling or conspirative lodgings, they gather, as in the days of the Tsar, but with even greater danger and more dread of the all-pervading presence of the Tcheka. They come to the lodgings singly, stealthily, like criminals conscious of guilt, fearful of observation and discovery. Frequently they fall into an ambush. The house may be in the hands of a zasada, though no sign of it is perceptible on the outside. No one having entered, however innocently or accidentally, may depart, not even a neighbor's child come to borrow a dish or some water for a sick member of the family. None is permitted to leave, that he may not give warning to possible victims. Such a zasada generally lasts for many hours, often even for several days and nights. When it is finally lifted, those caught in the net are turned over to the Tcheka. Lucky if the charge of counter-revolution or banditism be not made, and the prisoners released after several weeks of detention. But the leaders, the known revolutionists, are kept for months, even for years, without a hearing or charge. It is dusk. In the unlighted, dingy room, it is difficult to recognize the half-score of men occupying chairs, smoking and talking in subdued voices. The person for whom I inquire has not yet arrived, and I find myself a stranger in the place. I notice nervous glances in my direction. The men near me regard me with frank suspicion. One by one they leave their seats. I see them gathering in a corner, casting inimical looks at me. As I approach them, they cease talking and eye me defiantly. Their manner is militant, and presently I am surrounded by the hostile crowd. "May I see Comrade P?" I inquire. "Who may you be?" someone demands ironically. To allay their suspicions, I ask for Tovarich Astrov, the famous Menshevik leader with whom I have an appointment. Explanations follow, and at last the men appear satisfied regarding my identity. "You are looking for Astrov?" they ask in surprise. "Don't you know? Haven't you heard?" "What?" "He's been arrested this morning." Bitter indignation and excitement prevail in labor and revolutionary circles as a result of the arrest. Astrov, a well-known socialist, is a personality respected throughout Russia. His opposition to the Bolsheviki is purely intellectual, excluding hostile activities against the government. It is reported, however, that the authorities hold him, quote, morally responsible, unquote, for the wave of strikes that has recently swept the city. Astrov's comrades are distracted at their failure to ascertain the fate of their leader. The Tcheka declines to accept a paradacha, packages of food or clothing, an omen which inspires the worst fears. It indicates strictest isolation. It may even signify that the prisoner has been shot. Footnote. Astrov later died in prison. End footnote. More hated even than in Kiev is the Tcheka in Odessa. Ghastly stories are told of its methods and the ruthlessness of the predsedatel, a former immigrant from Detroit. The personnel of the institution consists mostly of old gendarme officers and criminals whose lives had been spared, quote, for services to be rendered in fighting counter-revolution and speculation, unquote. The latter is particularly prescribed, the highest form of punishment, shooting, being meted out to offenders. Executions take place daily. The doomed are piled into automobile trucks, face downward, and driven to the outskirts of the city. The long line of the death vehicles is escorted by mounted men riding wildly and firing into the air, a warning to close the windows. At the appointed place, the procession halts. The victims are made to undress and to take their places at the edge of the already prepared common grave. Shots resound. The bodies, some lifeless, some merely wounded, fall into the hole and are hastily covered with sod. But though the speculation is forbidden, and the position or exchange of czarist money is frequently punished by death, the members of the Tcheka themselves receive part of their salary in tsarskyi, whose purchasing power is many times that of Soviet paper. There is considerable circulation of the forbidden currency on the markets, and it is rumored that Tcheka agents themselves are the chief dealers. I refuse to believe the charge, till a member of the expedition informs me that he succeeded in advantageously converting some of the tsarskyi, officially given us in Moscow, into Soviet money. You are taking a great risk in exchanging, I warn him. No risk at all, he replied gleefully. Do you think I am tired of life that I would sell on the open market? I traded it through an old friend, and it was the good man N himself who did the little business for me. N is a high-placed magistrate of the Tcheka. With Emma Goldman, I attend a gathering of local anarchists come to meet the comrades from America. The large room is filled with a mixed company, students and workers, Soviet employees, soldiers, and some sailors. Every non-governmental tendency is represented. There are followers of Kropotkin and of Stirner, adherents of positivism and immediate actionists, with a number of Sovietsky anarchists, so called because of their friendly attitude to the Bolsheviki. It is an informal assembly of the widest divergence of opinion. Some denounce the communists as reactionary. Others believe in their revolutionary motives, but entirely disapprove of their methods. Several consider the present stage as a transitory but inevitable phase of the revolution. But the majority deny the historic existence of such a period. Progress, they claim, is a continuous process, every step foreshadowing and shaping the next. Long-continued despotism and terror destroy the possibilities of future liberty and brotherhood. The most animated discussion revolves about the proletarian dictatorship. It is the basic problem, determined by one's conception of revolution, and in turn determining one's attitude to the Bolsheviki. The younger element unreservedly condemned the party dictatorship, with its violence and bloodshed, its punitive measures, and general counter-revolutionary effects. The Sovietsky anarchists, though regretting the ruthlessness of communist practice, consider dictatorship inevitable at certain stages of the revolution. The discussion is drawn out for hours, and the vital question is obscured by theoretic assertions. I feel that the years of storm and stress have entirely uprooted the old values, without having clarified new concepts of reality and vision. Can you suggest something definite in place of the dictatorship? I ask at last. The situation demands a unified purpose. What we have is a dictatorship over the proletariat, retorts an enthusiastic Kropotkinist. Well, that is begging the question. Not the faults and shortcomings of the Bolsheviki are at issue, but the dictatorship itself. Does not the success of the revolution presuppose the forcible abolition of the bourgeoisie and the imposing of the proletarian will upon society? In short, a dictatorship. Assuredly, assents the young woman at my side, a left social revolutionist, but not the dictatorship of the proletariat only, rather the dictatorship of the toilers, including the peasantry as well as the city workers. If the communists would not persecute the anarchists, I'd be with them, remarks an individualist anarchist. The others scorn his narrow partisanship, but the Kropotkinists refuse to accept dictatorship. There may be times during a revolutionary period where violence, even organized force, becomes necessary, they admit, but these matters must rest in the hands of the workers themselves, and not be institutionalized in such bodies as the Tcheka, whose work is detrimental and fosters a counter-revolutionary spirit among the violated masses. The discussion gives no promise of reaching a basis for common work with the Bolsheviki. Most of those present have for years consecrated themselves to their ideal, have suffered persecution and imprisonment till at last the revolution triumphed. Now they find themselves outlawed even by the communists. They are deeply outraged by the, quote, advance guard of the proletariat, unquote, turning executioners of the best revolutionary elements. The abyss is too wide to be bridged. With deep sorrow, I think of the devotion, ability, and idealism thus lost to the revolution, and of the fratricidal strife the situation inevitably involves. September 3rd, 1920. Wrangel is reported to be advancing northwest after having defeated the Red Army in several engagements. Boudinny's cavalry is in retreat, leaving open the road to Rostov. Alyoshki, a suburb of Kherson, is invested by the Whites, and refugees are streaming into Odessa. Official silence feeds popular nervousness, and the wildest rumors are gaining circulation. Our work in the city is completed, but the new military situation makes it impossible to continue our journey southeast toward the Caucasus as originally planned. We have therefore decided that the expedition remain in Odessa while 2 of its members attempt to reach Nikolaev, there to determine the possibilities of proceeding further. The Predsedatel and secretary have been chosen for the task. My colleagues have already left the city to take up their quarters in the car. With our secretary, Alexander Shackle, I am loading the collected material on a cart. There is a large quantity, and the underfed old mare is barely able to pull the weight. It is pouring. The pavement is broken and slippery. The poor beast seems about to collapse. "Your horse is exhausted," I remarked to the driver, a peasant woman. She does not reply. The reins have fallen out of her hands, her head is bent forward, and her body is shaken, as if with the ague. "What is the matter, Matushka?" I call to her. She looks up. Her eyes are red, and tears are coursing down her cheeks, leaving streaks of yellow dirt behind. "Curses be upon you," she mutters between sobs. The horse has stopped. The rain is pouring with increased force. The chill pierces knife-like. "Cursed be you all," she cries vehemently. We try to soothe her. The secretary, a native Russian, herself of peasant stock, impulsively kisses the old woman on both cheeks. By snatches, we learn that 2 days ago she had carted a load of hay to the city, part of her village's share of the Razvyorstka. Returning home, she was halted by a requisitioning detachment. She pleaded that her cattle had long ago been confiscated and only the one horse left her. As the widow of a Red Army man, she is exempt from further requisition. But she had no documents with her, and she was taken to the police station. The commissar berated his men for impressing an unfit animal for army duty, and the woman was overjoyed, but as she was about to leave, he detained her. "Your horse will do for light jobs," he said. "You will give us 3 days' labor duty." She has been working 2 days now, receiving only half a pound of bread and no fodder for the beast except a little straw. This morning she was ordered to our quarters. Most of the vehicles and horses have been nationalized. Those still privately owned are subject to temporary requisition by the Tramot Transport Bureau for a specified number of hours weekly. In vain we hail the passing izvostchiki. All pretend to be on Soviet duty. The woman grows hysterical. The horse is apparently unable to move further. The rain is wetting our material, the wind tearing at our newspaper files and blowing precious leaves into the street. At last, with voices and shoulders, we induce the horse to proceed, and after a long ride we reach the railroad station. There we hastily write a receipt testifying that the requisitioned peasant and horse have fulfilled their labor duty, give the woman a chunk of bread and a few tidbits for her children, and send her home, bowing and repeating, "Bless you, good Barin, Master. God bless you." End of Chapter 32. Read by Eli Bishop, San Francisco, February 19th, 2022.
Chapter 33 of The Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynette Caulkins. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Dark People. Railroad communication between Odessa and Nikolaev is suspended, but we have been informed that a motor truck belonging to the maritime Osoby Outdiel, Tcheka, is to leave for that city at midnight on September 6th. Accompanied by the secretary, I proceeded early in the evening to the place of departure. For hours we tramped unfamiliar streets and tortuous alleys without finding the appointed place. Fearfully my companion clung to me. Odessa's reputation for lawlessness and the brutality of its bandit element filled us with alarm. In the darkness we lost our bearings and kept circling within the crooked alleys near the docks, when suddenly there came the command, "Who goes there?" and we faced guards pointing guns at us. Fortunately, we had secured the military password. "Tu latar." "Tarantas," the soldier completed, permitting us to pass and directing us on our way. It was after 2 a.m. when we reached the maritime Outdiel, but no machine was in sight, and we were overwhelmed with disappointment at the thought that we had missed the rare opportunity of reaching Nikolaev. Inquiries at the Tcheka elicited the unwilling information that the motor had not yet arrived, and no one knew when it was due. We spent the night in the street, the Chekists refusing us permission to remain indoors. At 5 in the morning, the car arrived, piled high with clothing and ammunition for the Nikolaev garrison. Quickly we climbed to the top, soon to be joined by a number of soldiers accompanied by women. Everything seemed ready for the start when the chauffeur announced that the gasoline issued him was not sufficient to carry us to our destination 200 miles northeast. A short, heavy-set sailor, addressed as commandant and apparently in charge of the journey, gruffly ordered everyone off the truck. His command ignored, he drew a revolver, and we all made haste to obey. "Now you'll have enough juice," he declared. The soldiers protested. They were the convoy sent to accompany the consignment to Nikolaev. Swearing and cursing, the drunken sailor consented to their riding, and they climbed back, pulling several girls up after them. "No heifers!" the sailor shouted, but the women, stretching themselves on top of the load, paid no attention. The commandant got into a violent altercation with the chauffeur, accusing him of delaying the departure and threatening to arrest him. The driver pleaded that the truck had not been loaded on time. Its belated arrival was not his fault. The Chekist cursed and swore in a manner that surpassed anything I had ever before heard in Russia, the variegated complexity of his oaths defying even approximate rendering into English. Meanwhile, the number of passengers had increased. The sailor grew furious, and again displaying his Colt, he forced everyone to climb down. 3 times the process was repeated, no one daring to resist the drunken commandant. We stood in the driving rain, the uncovered clothing on the truck getting soaked, while the chauffeur was pretending to be busy with the machine, yet stealthily watching the Chekist. Presently the latter walked out of the yard, whereupon the driver also disappeared. After an hour he returned, carrying a large can and followed by half a score of men and women. He announced that all was in readiness, and there began a scramble of the new arrivals for a place. At last the huge machine got into motion, the living mass on top desperately clinging for support as we gradually gained speed. "You'll never make half the way with that load," the commandant shouted, rushing out into the street and threateningly waving his gun. Over hills, down valleys, and across fields the auto sped, the chauffeur driving recklessly and every moment endangering our lives as the machine tore its way over large holes in the ground or wildly rushed down steep inclines. Our route lay along the sea and over wastelands still bearing evidence of past military activities. The large estate of Sokolnikov, the great Russian magnate, stretched for miles before us, entirely deserted, the celebrated cattle appropriated by the villagers, the place now uncultivated. "No seed," laconically commented one of the peasants. "What would be the use?" another replied. Long lines of wagons drawn by oxen and loaded with flour and potatoes crawled in the distance, the proceeds of the Rezbyorska being delivered to Odessa. The sailors, talkative and jolly, passed their time railing at the three peasants, typical Ukrainians. The latter took their banter in good humor, somewhat odd, and not always comprehending the full drift of the slangy Russian. They were much friendlier with the soldiers, themselves Ukrainians, and presently they began exchanging experiences. They hailed from Krasnaya Selo. The Resvyortska tax upon their village was very heavy, and the local Soviet had sent them to Odessa to secure a reduction of the assessment. But they received no satisfaction in the big city. They spent days in line at the various bureaus without accomplishing anything. Most of the officials just laughed at them. Others ignored them. One commissar even threatened to arrest them. Life has become harder than ever before, they complained. Under the Tsar they had been serfs. The white generals robbed them of their sons and cattle. They had set great hopes upon the Bolsheviki, but it is the same whoever comes, the peasants sighed. For us poor people, it's always the same. 2 of the soldiers had participated in the campaign against Makhno, and they were exchanging experiences. They spoke freely of his exploits, of the original methods that enabled him to defeat greatly superior forces, and of the numerous times he had been surrounded by white or red armies, yet always escaping, always in a most miraculous manner. They admired the clever ruse by which Makhno took Yekaterinoslav, then in the hands of Petlur. A handful of his men, dressed as peasants, crossed the bridge leading to the lower part of the city with their arms hidden in carts. On reaching the other side, they unexpectedly opened fire on the Petlur men guarding the approaches. The sudden attack struck panic to the garrison, and Makhno's army easily took the city. "We've got to catch him," one of the soldiers concluded, as if in self-justification. "But you can't deny it. He's a molodets, daring fellow." Both of them had once been taken prisoners by Makhno. Their last hour had come, they thought, as together with other captives they were led before the feared Butka. A slender young man with sharp, piercing eyes faced them sternly and began haranguing them. Bolshevik commissars were no better than white generals, he said. Both oppressed the people and robbed the peasants. He, Makhno, would defend the revolution against all enemies. He promised that the prisoners would be given the choice of joining the povstanci or going home. But the red soldiers feared Makhno was deriding them. Yet he kept his word. "Butka kills only Jews and commissars," one of the peasants drawled. In the evening we stopped at Krasnaya Selo, in the district of the German colonies. The little frame houses, whitewashed and clean, were a pleasant contrast to the straw-thatched, dirty izba of the Russian peasant. Few men were to be seen, most of them drafted in the white or red armies. Only women, children, and very old peasants were about. With my companion I followed a party of sailors and soldiers in search of lodgings for the night. At our approach the villagers ran terrified indoors. The sailors ordered them to bring food, but the women, weeping and imploring for mercy, called God to witness that the recent Resvyortska had taken their last provisions. They could offer only bread and country cheese. The Tchekists swore at them, fingered their guns, and demanded to be taken to the cellar. There they appropriated whatever eatables they could find. Distressed, I left with my companion to seek hospitality for ourselves. Word had passed of the arrival of the commissars, and the houses were barricaded. After many vain attempts, we gained admission to a chata at the furthest end of the village. It was occupied by a woman and her 3 children, the oldest a girl of 14, whom her mother had hidden at our approach. She accepted our offer to pay, and set black bread and sour milk before us. Soon the neighbors began to drop in. They stood timidly on the threshold, observing us with unfriendly eyes and exchanging whispered remarks. Gradually they gained confidence, advanced toward the table, and began conversing. They were totally ignorant of the events in the world at large. What was happening in Russia, even, was entirely incomprehensible to them. They knew that the Tsar was no more, and that freedom had been given the peasant, but they felt some huge deceit had been played on the dark people by those in high places. They were constantly harassed by the military, they complained. Soldiers of every kind and armed men without uniforms kept swooping down upon the village, taxing, confiscating, and pillaging. One by one their male folk had been drafted, often not even knowing into what army, and then the boys began to be taken, as young as 16. Generals and commissars kept coming and carrying the last away, and now all the cattle are gone, and the fields cannot be worked except by hand in little patches, and even the smallest children must help. Frequently the older girls are dragged away by officers and soldiers, returning later hurt and sick. In a neighboring village, the punitive expedition whipped old peasants on the public square. In a place 30 versts from Krasnaya, 18 peasants hanged themselves after the commissars had left. "Is it as bad in other parts?" my hostess asked. "How is it in Germany? My people come from there." "Germany has also had a revolution," I informed her. "The Kaiser is gone." "Revolution?" she repeated in utter incomprehension. "Did Germany have war?" I spent the night on a straw heap in the outhouse, joining our party early in the morning. The scenes of the previous day repeated themselves all along our route. A very old city, and once an important shipbuilding center, Nikolaev has played a prominent part in the labor and socialist history of Russia. It was the scene of the first great strike in the country in the early days of the 19th century. In the Nihilist and People's Will period, it was the field of much underground revolutionary activity. In later years, Nikolaev was the home of the South Russian Union, one of the first social democratic groups in Lower Ukraine, with Trotsky as its intellectual leader. Among the old archives, we came upon documents relating to the case of Nechayev, which in some strange manner found their way there, though that famous terrorist had never been arrested in this city. We also discovered police search orders issued against Lepotin, Bakunin, and other celebrated revolutionists of that period. Nikolaev still retains some of its former beauty, though its boulevards have been entirely denuded of trees, cut down within the 2 days' interregnum between the leaving of the Whites and the coming of the Bolsheviki. The streets are oppressively quiet. The city is in direct line of Wrangell's advance. The communists are feverishly active to rouse the population to united defense, appealing particularly to the proletarians and reminding them of the slaughter of the workers by Slatchev, Wrangell's chief general, notorious as a labor executioner. Footnote: General Slatchev-Krinsky was later received with special honors into the Red Army and sent by Trotsky to subdue the Karelian peasants, 1922. End footnote. The attitude of the surrounding districts is causing the Bolsheviki much anxiety. The peasantry has been in continual rebellion against the Soviet regime, and the arbitrary methods of labor mobilization have alienated the workers. The documents I have examined at the unions and the statistics concerning the distribution of labor power, rabsil, and desertion show that almost every village in the provinces of Kherson and Nikolaev has offered armed resistance. Yet the peasants have no sympathy with the monarchism of Wrangel. His victory may deprive them of the land they had taken from the large estates. Several provincial Soviets have sent delegates to Nikolaev to assure the authorities of their determination to fight the Whites. Encouraged, the Communists are conducting an intensive agitation among the peasantry along the route of Wrangel. fear of the whites has revived stories of their atrocities. The Jewish population lives in mortal dread, previous occupations having been accompanied by fearful pogroms. At the underground restaurant near the Soviet House, the guests relate incidents of almost incredible barbarities. They speak indiscriminately of whites, greens, Mariusa, Makhno, and others who have at various times invested the city. It is asserted that Mariusa, an Amazon of mysterious identity, refrains from pillage. She kills only communists and commissars. Some insist that she is a sister of Makhno, though the latter has none, while others say she is a peasant girl who had sworn vengeance against the Bolsheviki because her lover was killed by a punitive expedition. The Black Years may know who they all be, the hostess comments. When Makhno was here last time, people said they saw Mariusa with him. They beat and robbed Jews at the docks. You are wrong, the young Soviet employee who has been assigned to aid my work protests. I helped to examine the men caught at that time. They were Greens and Grigoriev bandits. Mariusa wasn't then in the city at all. I heard Makhno himself speak, remarked Vera, the daughter of the hostess, a young college girl. It was on the square, and someone held a big black flag near him. He told the people they had nothing to fear, and that he would not permit any excesses. He said he would mercilessly punish anyone attempting a pogrom. I got a very favorable impression of him. Whoever it is that makes pogroms, her mother retorted, we Jews are always the first victims. Jews and commissars, the youth corrects. You are both. You'd better look out, a guest teased him. Better take off that kurtka, leather jacket, another warns. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of the Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. A Bolshevik Trial. Having learned that old police records are in possession of the Extraordinary Commission, I visited Burov, the Predседатель of the Tcheka. Very tall and broad, of coarse features and curt demeanor, he gave me the impression of a gendarme of the Romanov regime. He spoke in an abrupt, commanding tone, avoided my look, and seemed more interested in the large Siberian dog at his side than in my mission. He declined to permit me to examine the archives of the 3rd Department, but promised to select some material the museum might be interested in, and asked me to call the next day. His manner was not convincing, and I felt little faith in his assurances to aid my efforts. The following morning, his secretary informed me that Burov had been too busy to attend to my request, but he could be seen at the Revolutionary Tribunal, where a trial was in progress. On the dais of the tribunal, 3 men sat at a desk covered with a red cloth, the wall back of them decorated with lithographs of Lenin and Trotsky. At a small table below the dais was the defendant, a slender young man with a diminutive mustache, and near him an older man, his attorney. Burov, with the huge dog at his feet, was acting as the government prosecutor. The benches were occupied by witnesses, and soldiers were stationed in the aisles to preserve order. The prisoner was charged with counter-revolutionary activities, the accusation brought by a young woman on the ground that he had denounced her as a communist to the whites. The witnesses were questioned first by the defense, then by the prosecutor and the judges. It appeared from their testimony that the prisoner and his accuser had for years lived in the same house and were known to be intimate. The proceedings dragged in a sleepy, uninteresting way until the attorney for the defense attempted to establish the fact that the woman, now a member of the Tcheka, had formerly led a disreputable life. Burov slowly rose in his seat and, pointing his finger at the lawyer, demanded, "Do you dare to attack the reputation of the Extraordinary Commission?" The attorney timidly appealed to the court for protection. The presiding judge, in high boots and corduroy jacket, looking very tired and sipping cold coffee, expressed his revolutionary sympathy with the social victims of the abolished capitalist order and berated the attorney for persisting in bourgeois prejudices. Burov examined the defense witnesses regarding their past mode of life and present political adherence. He referred to the prisoner as that scoundrelly counter-revolutionist and succeeded in eliciting affirmative replies to questions previously negated by the same witnesses. One of the latter, a young woman, testified to the good reputation of the defendant and his political nonpartisanship. She looked frightened as Burov towered above her. He plied her with questions and she became confused. Under the spell of the Chekist's commanding voice, she finally admitted that the accused was her brother. A burst of indignation broke from the audience. On the bench in front of me, an old man excitedly shouted, "You've terrorized her. She is no kin of his. She's my daughter." The presiding judge shouted, "Silence," and ordered the arrest of the interrupter for behavior insulting to the high tribunal. During the noon recess, I found an opportunity to speak to Burov. I called his attention to the character of the testimony. It was valueless, I pointed out. The witnesses were intimidated. Burov was much pleased. "There is no fooling with us, and they know it," he said, indicating that all non-communists are to be regarded as the natural enemies of the Bolshevik regime. "The evidence is questionable," I pursued. "Will the prisoner be convicted?" "I'll demand the highest measure of punishment," he replied, employing the official term for the death sentence. "But the man may be innocent," I protested. "How can you speak so, Tovarish?" he upbraided me. "You talk of evidence. Why, the uncle of this fellow was a rank bourgeois, a big banker. He escaped with the whites, and his whole family are counter-revolutionists. The best thing to do with such fellows is to razmenyat them, to change the expression used in the South for summary execution." Leaving the courtroom, I inadvertently stepped into a small chamber where two women sat on a bench. "Tovarish," from the center, one of them greeted me. "I saw you at Burov's yesterday." She evidently took me for an official of the Moscow Tcheka and she at once became confidential. It was she who brought the charge against the prisoner, she said. They had been arrested together by the whites, and when they were brought to the police station, the defendant whispered something to the officer. She could not hear what he said, but she was sure that he had nodded in her direction. Both were locked up, but after a while the man was released while she was to be shot. She was positive the man had denounced her as a Bolshevik, though she was not one at the time. She has become a communist since, and now she is helping to fight counter-revolutionists. Same as you, Tovarish, she added significantly. Her face, offensively painted even to her lips, was coarse and sensuous. Her eyes glowed with a vengeful light and the consciousness of power. Her companion, younger and more comely, resembled her in a marked degree. "Are you sisters?" I asked. "Cousins," the younger one replied. "Katya is lying," she broke out vehemently. "She's jealous. The man left her. He didn't care for her. She wants revenge." "A lot he cares for you," the other mocked. "You are younger, that's all. And he's a dirty counter-revolutionist." The door opened and a woman entered. She looked very old, but her carriage was stately and her sad face beautiful in its frame of snowy white. "Are you a witness?" the Tchekist girl demanded. "Have you been called?" "No, my dear," the old lady replied quietly. "I came of my own accord." She smiled benignantly and continued in a soft, melodious voice. "Listen, dear, I am an old woman and I will soon be dying. I came to tell the truth. Why should you cause the death of that boy?" She looked kindly at the Tchekist. "Bethink yourself, dear one. He has done you no harm." "Hasn't he, though?" the other retorted angrily. "My dear one," the old lady pleaded, putting her hand affectionately on the girl's arm, "let bygones be bygones. He cared for you and he ceased to care. Does he deserve death, dearest? Ah, I am old and I have seen much evil in my lifetime. Must we always go on hating and killing?" "To court!" a soldier shouted into the room. Both girls hurriedly rose, smoothed their hair, and walked out. "Must we always be hating and killing?" the old woman repeated as she slowly followed them. End of chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of the Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Returning to Petrograd. After a stay of several days, we left Nikolaev, returning to Odessa by the same maritime auto truck. We followed the former route and witnessed the previous scenes again. Our reception was even more unfriendly than before. Occasionally, some good-natured soldiers offered to pay with Sovietsky money, but the villagers pleaded that they could do nothing with the colored papers, and begged for articles of manufacture. The chauffeur produced a can of watered gasoline, which he had persuaded an old peasant to exchange for a smoked ham by assuring him that it was the best kerosene in Russia. The neighbors protested, but the old man, too frightened to refuse, gave up the treasured meat, muttering, "May the Lord have mercy on us, and see you depart soon." In Odessa, we learned that the Red Army is in full retreat from Warsaw, and Wriggleo steadily advancing from the southeast. The alarming situation makes the farther progress of the expedition impossible. Our anxiety increased by the circumstance that the mandate for the use of the car expires on October 31st, after which date the Railroad Commission has the right of immediate confiscation involving the probable loss of our material. Our repeated letters and wires have remained without reply by the Narkomput, People's Commissariat of Ways and Communication, in Moscow. No choice is left us but to hasten back to Petrograd to deliver to the museum our collection, which has grown so large it requires an entire Tepolshka freight car. September 20 through 30. At last we have left Odessa and are now journeying by slow stages northward. The lines are clogged with military trains, dead engines, and wrecked cars. At Znamenka we come upon the rear of the 12th Army retreating in disorder. The Bolsheviki are evacuating points along the route of the expected Polish advance. Large areas have been left without any government at all. The Communists have departed, the Poles not pursuing. The Red Army is rolling back toward Kiev and Kharkov. Our train is constantly delayed or switched to a side track to clear the way for the military. Should the enemy advance, our expedition may be entirely cut off from the north, finding itself between Wrigleo's forces in the south and southeast, and the Poles in the north and northwest. Progressing only a few miles a day, we pass Bursula, Vanyarke, Zermerinka, and Kasetkin. The Communists no longer deny the great disaster. The Polish campaign has ended in a complete rout, and Wriggleo is driving the Red Army before him. It is claimed that Makhno has joined forces with the counter-revolutionary general. The Soviet papers we occasionally find in the educational bureau at the stations brand the Pastanse leader as Wrigleo's aide. Familiar with the methods of the communist press, we do not give credence to the news, but our anxiety to learn the facts of the situation is increased by the persistent report that England demands the entire withdrawal of the Bolsheviki from the Ukraine. The approaches to Kiev are blocked and we are detained 12 versts from the city. 2 days of maneuvering bring us at last in visible distance of the passenger station, where we remain for the night. Kiev is being evacuated. A visit to the Union headquarters fails to discover any prominent officials. They are preparing to leave in case of revolutionary necessity. There is much speculation whether the Bolsheviki will release the political prisoners before surrendering the town, as the enemy will undoubtedly execute all revolutionists who fall into its hands. On the streets, joy at the departed communists struggles with dread of the hated Poles. Rising next morning at 9, by the new time, 7 by the sun, I am surprised not to find my clothes in their accustomed place. Believing my friends to have played a hoax, I proceed to wake them. All my apparel and personal effects are gone. We have been robbed. The thief evidently entered through the open corridor window. The imprint of his bare feet is still on the rain-softened ground. We are certain the thief was committed by the military, guarding the wood pile about 30 feet from our car. It was a moonlit night. No one could have climbed through the window without being seen by the sentry. In any case, a desperate undertaking for such acts are now punishable with death. Our interviews with the soldiers, inquiry and investigation fail to throw light on the robbery, and at heart we are glad. The loss, however great, is not worth a human life. October 2nd. Journeying toward Kursk, we still hope to be able to return south by way of Yekaterinnoslav, but rumors are persistent of the taking of that city by Wrangel. Splendid autumn day, clear and sunny. The country is luscious, fields of black soil, primitive forests of oak and fir. But the weather is growing cold, and our car is unheated for lack of dry wood. Our supplies are almost exhausted. Even the resourceful culinary art of Emma Goldman is unable to produce meals from an empty larder. In the evening, a rare sunset over the western slope, the horizon aglow with luminous red. Broad lines of purple float on the azure background, its base a light yellow of frayed edges. Now the dense wood hide the sky. I catch glimpses of the paling fire shimmering through the trees. Windmills of ancient Russian type and peasant haitier, their roofs straw-covered, sides whitewashed, slowly pass by, looking melancholy. Women at work in the fields, children driving a flock of black sheep, a solitary peasant trudges behind a pair of oxen hitched to a plough of primitive design. The country is even, flat, and monotonous. It is growing dusk. Our candles are exhausted. In the gathering darkness, our little commune around the table, we exchange reminiscences. Today is my first anniversary of my release from the federal prison. Footnote: in Atlanta, Georgia, when the author served 2 years for anti-militarist propaganda. End of footnote. A year rich with experience, intense days of anti-conscription agitation and opposition to world slaughter, arrest and detention at Ellis Island, stealthy deportation, and then Russia, and the life of the revolutionary period. With touching curiosity of the Russian in all things American, our colleagues are absorbed in the story. The skyscraper, that bold striving toward the heights, is the symbol of the far-off world to them. Though theoretically familiar with American industrialism, their faith in that country as free is traditionally persistent, and they experience a rude awakening at the recital of the actual facts of our economic and political life. Habituated to think the American a gentleman of large and noble nature with a touch of manly irresponsibility, almost akin to interesting madness, they are deeply shocked by the picture of prison existence with its tortures of solitary, underground dungeon, and bull ring. Under the most cruel Tsarist regime, they assure me, the politicals were accorded better treatment even in the worst casemates of Petropavlovsky and Schlesselburg. Is it possible, our secretary asks me for the 3rd time, that in free cultured America a prisoner may for years be kept in solitary, deprived of exercise and visitors? Only 1 year ago, yet how far it all seems, how removed from the present. Long trains of artillery rush through the darkness. The Revolutionary Army is routed on all fronts. The soldiers' plaintive song, now Russian, now Ukrainian, grips the heart with heavy sadness, as our train slowly creeps along the flatlands of northern Ukraine. October 21st. A clear, cold day. The first snow of the season on the ground. Moscow presents a familiar sight, and I feel at home after our long absence. Eagerly, I absorb the news at the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. The 12th Army has precipitately retreated from Warsaw, but the Poles are not pursuing. It is officially realized now what a serious and costly mistake the campaign was, and how baseless the expectations of a revolution in Poland. It is hoped that a quick peace may be patched up without too great sacrifices on the part of Russia. Happier is the news from other fronts. Eastern Siberia has been cleared of the last remnants of Kolchak's army, under Atman Simonov. In the Crimea, Wrangely is almost entirely crushed. Not the least share of credit admittedly belonged to Mahano. Far from aiding the counter-revolutionary forces, as had been reported, the Pastanse joined the fight against the White General. This development was the result of a politico-military agreement between the Bolsheviki and Mahano, the main condition of the latter being the immediate liberation of the imprisoned anarchists and Mahnose, and a guarantee of free speech and press for them in Ukraine. The telegram sent at the time by Mahano requesting the presence of Emma Goldman and myself at the conference did not reach us. It was not forwarded by the Foreign Office. Our anxiety about Henry Ellsberg is relieved. He is now safely in Riga, having been permitted to leave Russia after his forced return from the south. Albert Boni and Pat Quinlan are in the Tcheka, no definite reason for their detention being assigned. Miss Harrison, my erstwhile neighbor in the Harytolnensky, is held as a British spy. Narotiva, Soviet representative in New York, was deported from the States and is now at the head of the British-American Bureau in the Foreign Office. Rosenberg, the bad-tempered and ill-mannered confidential secretary of Chicherin, all power and cordially disliked, is about to leave for the Far East on an important mission, as he informs me. Incidentally, as if by afterthought, he refers to the funeral tomorrow, and with a shock, I learn of the death of John Reed. The expedition is to leave this evening for Petrograd, but we decide to postpone our departure in order to pay the last tribute to our dead friend. A fresh grave along the Kremlin wall, opposite the Red Square, the honored resting place for the revolutionary martyrs. I stand at the brink, supporting Louis Rent, who has entirely abandoned herself to her grief. She has hastened from America to meet Jack after a long separation. Missing him in Petrograd, she proceeded to Moscow, only to learn that Reed had been ordered to Baku, to the Congress of Eastern Peoples. He had not quite recovered from the effects of his imprisonment in Finland, and he was unwilling to undertake the arduous journey. But Zinoviev insisted. It was imperative, he said, to have America represented, and like a good party soldier, Jack obeyed. But his weakened constitution could not withstand the hardships of Russian travel and its fatal infections. Reed was brought back to Moscow, critically ill. In spite of the efforts of the best physicians, he died on October 16th. The sky is wrapped in gray. Rain and sleet are in the air. Between the speaker's words, the rain strikes Jack's coffin, punctuating the sentences as if driving nails into the casket. Clear and rounded, like the water drops are the official eulogies falling upon the hearing with dull meaninglessness. Louis cowers on the wet ground. With difficulty, I persuade her to rise, almost forcing her to her feet. She seems in a daze, oblivious to the tribute of the party mourners. Baccarin, Reinstein, and representatives of the communist sections of Europe and America praise the advance guard of the world revolution, while Louis is desperately clutching at the wooden coffin. Only young Feodosiev, who has known and loved Jack and shared quarters with him, sheds a ray of warmth through the icy sleet. KalenXI speaks of the fine manhood and generous soul that was Jack. With painful sincerity, she questions herself. Did not John Reed succumb to the neglect of true comradeship? The museum is highly pleased with the success of our expedition. In token of appreciation, the board of directors requested us to continue our work in the Crimea, now entirely freed from white forces. The mandate for the car has been prolonged till the close of the year, but the independent, non-partisan character of the museum activities is apparently displeasing to the communist circles in Moscow. They contend that the capital, rather than Petrograd, should be the home of such an institution. The idea is sponsored, it is said, in opposition to the growing power of Zinoviev. Certain influences are at work to curtail the museum's sphere of action. With surprise, we learn that a special body has been created in the center with exclusive authority to collect material concerning the history of the Russian Party. The new organization, known as the Ispart, by virtue of its communist character, claims control over the museum and has announced its intention of directing future expeditions. The situation threatens the efficacy of our work. By request of the museum, I have repeatedly visited Moscow in an endeavor to reach an amicable understanding. Lynette, with whom I have discussed the matter, admits the justice of our position, but the Ispart continues to assert its supremacy, claims the right to our car, and insists on controlling the expeditions by placing a political commissar in charge. The attitude of the Ispart is inimical to free initiative and best effort. It is also indicative of a lack of confidence. If persisted in, it would exclude my further cooperation. Under no conditions could I consent to the supervision of a commissar whose duties are virtually identical with spying and denunciation. Several of my colleagues in the expedition, including Emma Goldman, share this viewpoint. During the negotiations, it has been suggested that we visit the far north to gather the historic data of the period of Allied occupation and the provisional government of Tchaikovsky. The Ispart professes no interest in the undertaking and forgoes control over it. We welcome the opportunity and decide to make a short journey to Archangel via Moscow, where formalities are to be completed, In the capital, we find our friends in great consternation. The Bolsheviki, it is charged, have treacherously broken their agreement with Makhno. No sooner had Postance helped to defeat Wrangel than Trotsky ordered their disarmament. They were surrounded and attacked by Red forces, but succeeded in extricating themselves, and now open warfare has again been declared. Meanwhile, the anarchists, unaware of these developments, had gathered from all parts of the country in Kharkov, where a conference was to be held December 1st, in accordance with Makhno's agreement with the Bolsheviki. All of them together, with many local anarchists, were arrested, among them my friends, Volin and Baron, widely known as men of high idealism and revolutionary devotion. The greatest fear is felt for their safety. End of chapter 37. Read by Calvin Osborne.
Chapter 36 of the Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marie Christian. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. In the Far North. December 1920. Yaroslavl, an ancient city, is picturesque on the banks of the Volga. Very impressive are its cathedrals and monasteries, fine specimens of the architectural art of northeastern Russia of feudal times. But desolate is the sight of the many demolished buildings and churches. On the opposite side of the river, the whole district is wrecked by artillery and fire. Dismal reminders of the harrowing days of June 1918. When the counter-revolutionary insurrection, led by Savinkov, once famous terrorist, was crushed. More than a third of the city was destroyed, its population reduced by half. The shadow of that tragedy broods darkly over Yaroslavl. The hand laid upon the rebels was so heavy, its imprint is still felt. The people are cowed, terrified at the very mention of the ghastly days of June. Through Vologda we reach Archangel, at the mouth of the northern Dvina, almost within the Arctic Circle. The city is situated on the right bank, separated from the railroad station by the river, which we cross on foot. The ice is dotted with peasant sleighs, some drawn by reindeer with huge crooked antlers. The drivers are entirely wrapped in furs, only their narrow dark eyes and flat Lapland noses visible. The streets are clean, the small frame houses well kept. We have learned from the occupation. Kulikov, chairman of the Ispelkom, comments. He is a young man, tall, clean-featured, and of quick intelligence. The whites killed his entire family, including his young sister, but Kulikov has preserved his mental balance and humanity. Comparative order prevails in the Soviet institutions. The long queues so characteristic of Bolshevik managements are almost entirely absent. The natives have acquired method and efficiency, from the example of the Americans, they frankly admit. There is scarcity of provisions, but the pyok is more equitable, distribution more systematic than elsewhere. The communists are the dominant factor, but they are encouraging the cooperation of the other elements of the population. Experience has taught them to economize human life. Many former white officers are employed, even in responsible positions. Their services are very satisfactory, I am told. Particularly in the schools they are of help. Even monks and nuns have been given opportunity to serve the people. Some art workshops are managed by former inmates of monasteries, still in their religious garb, sewing and embroidering for the children and instructing them in the art. The orphan homes and asylums we have visited, unannounced, are clean and tidy, the inmates warmly dressed and of healthy appearance, their relations with the teachers very harmonious, even affectionate. Speculation in food has entirely ceased. The old marketplace is almost deserted. Only small articles of apparel are offered for sale. The distributing Soviet centers still have some of the provisions, mostly canned goods, left by the American mission, which is remembered with respect, almost with regret. But considerable sentiment is felt against the English, who are charged with political partisanship in the civil struggle of the North. The story is told of the destruction of huge supplies sunk in the Dvina in the very sight of the starved population, by order of General Rawlins, who is in charge of the British evacuation. The cordial cooperation of Kulikov and other communist officials has enabled us to collect valuable material on the history of the provisional government of the Northern District. A pitiful picture it presents of Tchaikovsky, once the grandfather of the Russian Revolution. Forswearing his glorious past, he served as the vassal of Kolchak, whom he servilely acknowledged as the supreme ruler of Russia. So impotent, however, was the role of Tchaikovsky that his regime is contemptuously referred to as the government of Miller, the commander-in-chief of the counter-revolutionary forces, which escaped to Norway soon after the British evacuation. Though comprising but a small part of the population, the workers of Archangel, about 3,000 out of a total of 50,000, have played a decisive part in the history of the city and district. In the union gatherings, I have come in touch with intelligent proletarian groups whose independence and self-reliance is the key to the local situation. Far from the center and small in number, the Bolsheviki are vitally dependent on the labor element in the management of affairs. Party dictatorship has been mitigated by the actual participation of the toilers. Their influence is restraining and salutary. Bechin, the chairman of the Union Soviet, personifies the history and spirit of the whole revolutionary epoch. Tall and stockily built, of plain speech and convincing honesty, he is typical of the northern worker. In his person, the provisional government had sought to suppress the rebellious element of the Archangel proletariat. Popular labor man and member of the local Duma, Bechin was indicted for treason. The central figure of the celebrated trial, known by his name, he was condemned to a living death in the terrible prison at Iokanj in the frozen north. But his conviction served to consolidate the wavering ranks against the provisional government. His name became the slogan of the united opposition. Its rising waves drove the Allies from Archangel and Murmansk and abolished Tchaikovsky's regime. With much difficulty, I persuaded the modest Bechin to donate his picture and autobiographic sketch to the Revolutionary Gallery of the museum. His friends informed me that upon his return to prison, he insisted that his portraits be removed from the Union headquarters. In appreciation of our mission, he presented us with the old crimson banner of the Soviet, battle-scarred in numerous campaigns. "We are working in harmony with the several factions in the unions," Bechin said. "The welfare of the people is our sole aim, and on that platform we can all agree, whatever our political predilections." With a smile of indulgent reminiscence, he admitted his former adherence to the Social Democrats. "But we have no more Mensheviki here," he hastened to add. "We all joined the Bolsheviki long ago." "The comrade from the center probably doesn't know how it happened," his assistant remarked. "Revolutionary life sometimes plays curious pranks. You see," he continued, "word had reached us that the Mensheviki and SRs in Moscow had gone over to the Bolsheviki. We decided to do the same. That's how we happen to be communist now. But the report later proved false," he concluded with a touch of disappointment. "We have never regretted it," Bechin said soberly. "There is no direct railroad line between Archangel and Murmansk, and we are compelled to make the long journey back to Vologda in order to reach the coast. In Petrozavodsk, we learn that owing to the unusually severe snowstorms, the trip cannot be undertaken at present. It is Christmas Eve. Before the end of the year, we are pledged to return to Petrograd. To our great regret, the journey further north must be abandoned." End of chapter 36.
Chapter 37 of the Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Early days of 1921. The military fronts have been liquidated. Civil war is at an end. The country breathes a sigh of relief. The Entente has ceased to finance counter-revolution, but the blockade still continues. It is now generally realized that the hope of near revolution in Europe is visionary. The proletariat of the West, involved in a severe struggle with growing reaction at home, can give no aid to Russia. The Soviet Republic is thrown upon its own resources. All thoughts are turned to economic reconstruction. Communist circles and the official press are agitated by the discussion of the role of the workers in the present situation. It is admitted that militarization of labor has failed. Far from proving productive, as had been claimed, its effects have been disorganized and demoralizing. The new part to be assigned to the proletariat is the burning problem, but there is no unity of opinion among the leading Bolsheviki. Lenin contends that the unions are not prepared to manage the industries. Their main mission is to serve as schools of communism, with gradually increasing participation in the economic field. Zinoviev and his following side with Lenin and elaborate his views, but Trotsky dissents, insisting that the workers will for a long time to come be unfit to manage the industries. He demands a labor front, subject to the iron discipline of a military campaign. In opposition to this conception, the labor elements advocate the immediate democratization of industrial government. The exclusion of the unions from a decisive role in the economic life, they maintain, is the true cause of the deplorable situation. They are confident that the revolutionary proletariat, who has defeated all armed opposition, will also conquer the enemy on the economic field. But the workers must be given the opportunity. They will learn by doing. Throughout the country rages the discussion, on the solution of which depends the economic future of the people. Many of the anarchists arrested in Kharkov on the eve of the suppressed conference have been brought to Moscow. Some of them are in the Berturki, others are held incommunicado in the inner jail of the Tcheka. Volin A. Baron and Leah, the wife of my friend Yosef, the immigrant, are among them. Yosef is reported dead. With the consent of the Kharkov authorities, accompanied by two friends, he had gone to the Makhano camps to aid in arranging the conditions of agreement. On the way, all three disappeared, killed, it is assumed, just as they entered a village that was being pogromed. There are rumors of Bolshevik responsibility for the tragedy, but I cannot believe them guilty of such treachery. By the aid of Angelika Balabanova, we intercede on behalf of the victims of the broken truce between the Soviet government and Makhano. Almost all of them come within the communist definition of identity anarchists of ideas, and Lenin has assured me that the party is cordially disposed toward them. The efforts of Angelika have secured for me an appointment with Lassis, head of the Department of Secret Operations of the Tcheka in charge of the cases. But calling at the agreed hour, I am informed that Lassis, aware of the purpose of my visit, had left orders not to admit me. Still believing in the possibility of establishing more amicable relations between the Soviet government and the anarchists, I appeal to influential communists. The great task of rebuilding the country, I urge, necessitates mutual understanding and cooperation. But my Bolshevik friends scorn the suggestion as utopian, though some of them are willing to aid in the liberation of certain individuals by serving as their guarantee. At last I decide to address myself to Lenin. In a written communication I present to him the situation, and set forth the reasons, revolutionary, ethical, and utilitarian, for the release of the politicals in the interest of the common cause. In vain I await a reply. The prison doors remain closed. More arrests take place in various parts of the country. February 13th. Peter Kropotkin died on the 8th instant. Though not entirely unexpected, the news came to me as a great shock. I hastened from Petrograd to Dmitrov, where a number of personal friends of the dead man were already gathered. Almost the entire village accompanied the remains to the train bound for Moscow. Little children strewed the way with pine branches, and touching tribute was paid by the simple country folk to the man beloved in their midst. The Soviet government offered to take charge of the funeral, but the family of the Kropotkin and his comrades have declined. They feel that Peter, who throughout his life denied the state, should not in death be insulted by its attentions. The funeral commission, formed by the Moscow anarchist organizations, requested Lenin to permit the imprisoned comrades of the dead to attend the funeral of their friend and teacher. Lenin consented, and the Central Committee of the party recommended to the Tcheka the temporary release of the anarchists. Delegated by the commission to arrange the matter, I was given opportunity to visit the prisoners in the Berturkey. Over a score of them gathered about me, pale martyred faces with eager eyes and palpitating interest in the life they are deprived of. In the inner jail of the Tcheka, I was permitted to see A. Baron, the spokesman of the anarchists imprisoned there. Accompanying me was Yarchuk, himself but recently released. "You'll probably be with us again soon," the magistrate remarked to him with a sardonic grimace. Owing to the nationalization of all conveniences, printing facilities, and materials, the commission had been compelled to apply to the Moscow Soviet to enable it to carry out the funeral program. After considerable delay, permission had been secured to issue a one-day, 4-page in memoriam paper, but the authorities insist that the manuscripts, though exclusively devoted to appreciations of Kropotkin as a scholar, man, and anarchist, be submitted to censorship. The Tcheka refused to release the anarchist prisoners without a guarantee of the funeral commission for their return. That guarantee secured, the Extraordinary Commission informed me that upon examination it was found that there were no anarchists that could be freed. There followed an intensive exchange of opinions between the Moscow Soviet, in the person of Kamenev, its president, and the Tcheka, which has finally resulted in the solemn promise to permit all the imprisoned Moscow anarchists to attend the funeral. In the Hall of Columns, in the Union House, the remains of Peter Kropotkin lie in state. A continuous procession of workers, students, and peasants passes before the bier to pay the last tribute to the dead. Outside, a vast mass is waiting to accompany the remains to their resting place. All is in readiness. The requiem has been sung, the time set for starting has already passed. But the anarchist prisoners have not come. Urgent inquiries at the Tcheka elicit contradictory information. The collective guarantee of the commission is not satisfactory. We are told the men refuse to attend the funeral. They have already been released. It is past noon. The funeral is delayed. It is apparent that the Tcheka is sabotaging our agreement. We decide to protest by demonstratively removing the government and communist wreaths from the hall. The threat of a public scandal quickly brings the authorities to terms, and within a quarter of an hour the 7 prisoners of the inner jail arrive. We are assured that the Berturkey anarchists have been freed and will presently join us. The long procession slowly winds its way to the cemetery. The students, arms linked, form a living chain on both sides of the great multitude. The sun is bright upon the hard glistening snow. Black anarchist banners interspersed with the flashes of scarlet flutter above like mournful arms of love. A Kropotkin museum is to be founded in memory of the great anarchist, scientist, and teacher. The Committee of Anarchist Organizations in charge of the undertaking has requested Emma Goldman and myself to aid in its organization. Our further cooperation with the Museum of Revolution has become impossible, owing to the arbitrary attitude of the Espart. Moreover, the Kropotkin work is of greater immediate importance and of stronger appeal to my sympathies. I have severed my connections with the museum to accept the secretaryship of the Kropotkin Memorial Commission. End of Chapter 37. Read by Calvin Osborne.
Chapter 38 of the Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dan Bunbury. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Kronstadt. Petrograd, February 1921. The cold is extreme and there is intense suffering in the city. Snowstorms have isolated us from the provinces. The supply of provisions has almost ceased. Only a half-pound of bread is being issued now. Most of the houses are unheated. At dusk, old women prowl about the big woodpile near the Hotel Astoria, but the sentry is vigilant. Several factories have been closed for lack of fuel, and the employees put on half rations. They called a meeting to consult about the situation, but the authorities did not permit it to take place. The Trebochny mill workers have gone on strike. In the distribution of winter clothing, they complain, the communists received undue advantage over the non-partisans. The government refuses to consider the grievances till the men return to work. Crowds of strikers have gathered in the street near the mills, and soldiers were sent to disperse them. They were cursanti, communist use of the military academy. There was no violence. Now the strikers have been joined by the men from the admiralty shops and the Galenaria docks. There is much resentment against the arrogant attitude of the government. A street demonstration was attempted, but mounted troops suppressed it. February 27th. Nervous feeling in the city. The strike situation is growing more serious. The Petroni mills, the Baltiiski and La Ferme factories have suspended operations. The authorities have ordered the strikers to resume work. Martial law in the city. The Special Committee of Defense, Comitat Oroboni, is vested with exceptional powers. Zinoviev is at its head. At the Soviet session last evening, a military member of the Defense Committee denounced the strikers as traitors to the revolution. It was Lesevich. He looked fat, greasy, and offensively sensuous. He called the dissatisfied workers leeches attempting extortion, or Shureniki, and demanded drastic measures against them. The Soviet passed a resolution locking out the men of the Trebochny mill. It means deprivation of rations, actual starvation. February 28th. Strikers' proclamations have appeared in the streets today. They cite cases of workers found frozen to death in their homes. The main demand is for winter clothing and more regular issue of rations. Some of the circulars protest against the suppression of factory meetings. The people want to take counsel together to find means of relief, they state. Zinoviev asserts the whole trouble is due to Menshevik and socialist revolutionist plotting. For the first time, a political turn is being given to the strikes. Late in the afternoon, a proclamation was posted containing larger demands. A complete change is necessary in the policies of the government, it reads. First of all, the workers and peasants need freedom. They don't want to live by the decrees of the Bolsheviki. They want to control their own destinies. We demand the liberation of all arrested socialists and non-partisan working men. Abolition of martial law, freedom of speech, press, and assembly for all who labor. Free election of shop and factory committees, of labor union and Soviet representatives. March 1st. Many arrests are taking place. Groups of strikers surrounded by Tchekas are on the way to prison, a common sight. Much indignation in the city. I hear that several unions have been liquidated and their active members turned over to the Tcheka. But proclamations continue to appear. The arbitrary standard of the authorities is having the effect of rousing reactionary tendencies. The situation is growing tense. Calls for the Uchtakruka, the Constituent Assembly, are being heard. A manifesto is circulating signed by the socialist workers of the Nevsky district, openly attacking the communist regime. We know who is afraid of the Constituent Assembly, it declares. It is they who will no longer be able to rob us. Instead, they will have to answer before the representatives of the people for their deceit, their thefts, and all their crimes. Zinoviev is alarmed. He has wired to Moscow for troops. The local garrison is said to be in sympathy with the strikers. Military from the provinces has been ordered to the city. Special communist regiments have already arrived. Extraordinary martial law has been declared today. March 2nd. Most disquieting reports. Large strikes have broken out in Moscow. In the Astoria, I heard today that armed conflicts have taken place near the Kremlin and blood has been shed. The Bolsheviki claim the coincidence of events in the two capitals as proof of a counter-revolutionary conspiracy. It is said that the Kronstadt sailors have come to the city to look into the cause of trouble. Impossible to tell fact from fiction. The absence of a public press encourages the wildest rumors. The official papers are discredited. March 3rd. Kronstadt is disturbed. It disapproves of the government's drastic methods against the dissatisfied workers. The men of the warship Petropavlovsk have passed a revolution of sympathy with the strikers. It has become known today that on February 28th, a committee of sailors was sent to the city to investigate the strike situation. Its report was unfavorable to the authorities. On March 1st, the crews of the 1st and 2nd Squadrons of the Baltic Fleet called a public meeting at Yakorny Square. The gathering was attended by 16,000 sailors, Red Army men and workers. The chairman of the Executive Committee of the Kronstadt Soviet, the Communist Vasiliev, presided. The audience was addressed by Kameleon, President of the Republic, and by Kuzmin, Commissar of the Baltic Fleet. The attitude of the sailors was entirely friendly to the Soviet government, and Kameleon was met on his arrival in Kronstadt with military honors, music, and banners. At the meeting, the Petrograd situation and the report of the Sailors Investigating Committee were discussed. The audience was outspoken in its indignation at the means employed by Zinoviev against the workers. President Kameleon and Commissar Kuzmin berated the strikers and denounced the Petropavlovsk resolution as counter-revolutionary. The sailors emphasized their loyalty to the Soviet system, but condemned the Bolshevik bureaucracy. The resolution was passed. March 4th. Great nervous tension in the city. Strikes continue. Labor disorders have again taken place in Moscow. A wave of discontent is sweeping the country. Peasant uprisings are reported from Tambov, Siberia, the Ukraine, and the Caucasus. The country is on the verge of desperation. It was confidently hoped that with the end of the Civil War, the communists would mitigate the severe military regime. The government had announced its intention of economic reconstruction, and the people were eager to cooperate. They looked forward to the lightening of the heavy burdens, the abolition of wartime restrictions, and the introduction of elemental liberties. The fronts are liquidated, but the old policies continue, and the labor militarization is paralyzing industrial revival. It is openly charged that the Communist Party is more interested in entrenching its political power than in saving the revolution. An official manifesto appeared today. It is signed by Lenin and Trotsky and declares Kronstadt guilty of mutiny. The demand of the sailors for free Soviets is denounced as a counter-revolutionary conspiracy against the proletarian republic. Members of the Communist Party are ordered into the mills and factories to rally the workers to support of the government against the traitors. Kronstadt is to be suppressed. The Moscow radio station sent out a message addressed to all. Petrograd is orderly and quiet, and even the few factories where accusations against the Soviet government were recently voiced now understand that it is the work of provocateurs. Just at this moment, when in America a new Republican regime is assuming the reins of government and showing inclination to take up business relations with Soviet Russia, the spreading of lying rumors and the organization of disturbances in Kronstadt have the sole purpose of influencing the American president and changing his policy towards Russia. At the same time, the London Conference is holding its sessions, and the spreading of similar rumors must influence also the Turkish delegation and make it more submissive to the demands of the Entente. The rebellion of the Petropavlovsk crew is undoubtedly part of a great conspiracy to create trouble within Soviet Russia and to injure our international position. This plan is being carried out within Russia by Tsarist general and former officers, and their activities are supported by the Mensheviki and social revolutionists. The whole northern district is under martial law, and all gatherings are interdicted. Elaborate precautions have been taken to protect the government institutions. Machine guns were placed in the Astoria, the living quarters of Zinoviev and other prominent Bolsheviki. These preparations are increasing general nervousness. Official proclamations command the immediate return of the strikers to the factories, prohibit suspension of work, and warn the populace against congregating in the streets. The Committee of Defense has initiated a quote-unquote cleaning of the city. Many workers suspected of sympathizing with Kronstadt have been placed under arrest. All Petrograd sailors and part of the garrison thought to be untrustworthy have been ordered to distant points, while the families of Kronstadt sailors living in Petrograd are held as hostages. The Committee of Defense has notified Kronstadt that the prisoners are kept as pledges for the safety of the Commissar of the Baltic Fleet, N.N. Kuzmin, the chairman of the Kronstadt Soviet, T. Vasiliev, and other communists. If the least harm be suffered by our comrades, the hostages will pay with their lives. We want no bloodshed, Kronstadt wired in reply. Not a single communist has been harmed by us. The Petrograd workers are anxiously awaiting developments. They hope that the intercession of the sailors may turn the situation in their favor. The term of office of the Kronstadt Soviet is about to expire, and arrangements are being made for the coming elections. On March 2nd, a conference of delegates took place, at which 300 representatives of the ships, the garrison, the labor unions, and factories were present. Among them also a number of communists. The conference approved the resolution passed by the mass meeting the previous day. Lenin and Trotsky have declared it counter-revolutionary and proof of a white conspiracy. Footnote: the historic document, suppressed in Russia, is reproduced here in full. End of footnote. Resolution of the General Meeting of the Crews of the 1st and 2nd Squadrons of the Baltic Fleet, held March 1st, 1921. Having heard the report of the representatives sent by the General Meeting of the ship's crews to Petrograd to investigate the situation there, resolved: 1. In view of the fact that the present Soviets do not express the will of the workers and peasants, immediately to hold new elections by secret ballot, the pre-election campaign to have full freedom of agitation among the workers and peasants. 2. To establish freedom of speech and press for workers and peasants, for anarchist and left socialist parties. 3. To secure freedom of assembly for labor unions and peasant organizations. 4. To call for a non-partisan conference of the workers, Red Army soldiers, and sailors of Petrograd, Kronstadt, and of Petrograd province no later than March 19, 1921. 5. To liberate all political prisoners of socialist parties, as well as all workers, peasants, soldiers, and sailors imprisoned in connection with the labor and peasant movements. 6. To elect a commission to review the cases of those held in prison and concentration camps. 7. To abolish all political bureaus because no party should be given special privileges in the propagation of its ideas or receive the financial support of the government for such purposes. Instead, there should be established educational and cultural commissions locally elected and financed by the government. 8. To abolish immediately all Zagradiltenia Atreidi, armed units organized by the Bolsheviki for the purpose of suppressing traffic and confiscating foodstuffs and other products. The irresponsibility and arbitrariness of their methods were proverbial throughout the country. 9. To equalize the rations of all who work, with the exception of those employed in trades detrimental to health. 10. To abolish the communist fighting detachments in all branches of the army, as well as the communist guards kept on duty in mills and factories. Should such guards or military detachments be found necessary, they are to be appointed in the army from the ranks, and in the factories according to the judgment of the workers. 11. To give the peasants full freedom of action in regard to their land, and also the right to keep cattle, on condition that the peasants manage with their own means, that is, without employing hard labor. 12. To request all branches of the army, as well as their comrades, the military crescente, to concur in our resolutions. 13. To demand for the latter publicity in the press. 14. To appoint a traveling commission of control. 15. To permit the free individual small-scale production by one's own efforts. Resolution passed unanimously by brigade meeting, 2 persons refraining from voting. Petrichenko, Chairman, Brigade Meeting. Perep Elkin, Secretary. Resolution passed by an overwhelming majority of the Kronstadt garrison. Vasiliev, Chairman. Kalinin and Vasiliev vote against the resolution. March 4th. Late at night, the extraordinary session of the Petrol Soviet in the Tauride Palace was packed with communists, mostly youngsters, fanatical and intolerant. Admission by special ticket also had to be secured to return home after interdicted hours. Representatives of shops and labor committees are in the galleries, the seats in the main body having been occupied by the communists. Some factory delegates were given the floor, but the moment they attempted to state their case, they were shouted down. Zinoviev repeatedly urged the meeting to give the opposition an opportunity to be heard, but his appeal lacked energy and conviction. Not a voice was raised in favor of the Constituent Assembly. A mill worker pleaded with the government to consider the complaints of the workers, who are cold and hungry. Zinoviev replied that the strikers are the enemies of the Soviet regime. Kameleon declared Kronstadt the headquarters of General Kovlatsky's plot. The sailor reminded Zinoviev of the time when he and Lenin were hunted as counter-revolutionists by Kerensky and were saved by the very sailors who they now denounce as traitors. Kronstadt demands only honest elections, he declared. He was not allowed to proceed. The stentorian voice and impassioned appeal of Yevdokimov, Zinoviev's lieutenant, wrought the communists up to a high pitch of excitement. His resolution was passed amid a tumult of protest from the nonpartisan delegates and labor men. The resolution declared Kronstadt guilty of a counter-revolutionary attempt against the Soviet regime and demands its immediate surrender. It is a declaration of war. March 5th. Many Bolsheviki refused to believe that the Soviet Revolution will be carried out. It was too monstrous a thing to attack by force of arms the pride and glory of the Russian Revolution, as Trotsky christened the Kronstadt sailors. In the circle of their friends, many communists threatened to resign from the party should such a bloody deed come to pass. Trotsky was to address the Petro-Soviet last evening. His failure to appear was interpreted as indicating that the seriousness of the situation has been exaggerated. But during the night he arrived, and today he issued an ultimatum to Kronstadt. The workers' and peasants' government has decreed that Kronstadt and the rebellious ships must immediately submit to the authority of the Soviet Republic. Therefore I command all who have raised their hand against the socialist fatherland to lay down their arms at once. The obdurate are just to be disarmed and turned over to the Soviet authorities. The arrested commissars and other representatives of the government are to be liberated at once. Only those surrendering unconditionally may count on the mercy of the Soviet Republic. Simultaneously, I am issuing orders to prepare to quell the mutiny and subdue the mutineers by force of arms. Responsibility for that harm may be suffered by the peaceful population will fall entirely upon the heads of the counter-revolutionary mutineers. This warning is final. Trotsky, Chairman, Revolutionary Military Soviet of the Republic. Kamenev, Commander-in-Chief.
The city is on the verge of panic.
The factories are closed, and there are rumors of demonstrations and riots. Threats against Jews are becoming audible. Military forces continue to flow into Petrograd and Environs. Trotsky has sent another demand to Kronstadt to surrender, the order containing the threat, "I'll shoot you like pheasants." Even some communists are indignant at the tone assumed by the government. It is a fatal error, they say, to interpret the workers' plea for bread as opposition. Kronstadt's sympathy with the strikers and their demand for honest elections have been turned by Zinoviev into a counter-revolutionary plot. I have talked the situation over with several friends, including communists. We feel there is yet time to save the situation. A commission in which the sailors and workers would have confidence could allay the roused passions and find a satisfactory solution of the pressing problems. It is incredible that a comparatively unimportant incident, as the original strike in the Trubochny mill, should be deliberately provoked into civil war with all the bloodshed it entails. The communists with whom I have discussed the suggestion all favor it, but dare not take the initiative. No one believes in the Kozlovsky story. All agree that the sailors are the staunchest supporters of the Soviets. Their object is to compel the authorities to grant needed reforms. To a certain degree they have already succeeded. The Zagradnatelny Otredi, notoriously brutal and arbitrary, have been abolished in Petrograd province, and certain labor organizations have been given permission to send representatives to the villages for the purchase of food. During the last 2 days, special rations and clothing have also been issued to several factories. The government fears a general uprising. Petrograd is now in an extraordinary state of siege. Being out of doors is permitted only till 9 in the evening, but the city is quiet. I expect no serious upheaval if the authorities can be prevailed upon to take a more reasonable and just course. In the hope of opening the road to a peaceful solution, I have submitted to Zinoviev a plan of arbitration signed by persons friendly to the Bolsheviki. To the Petrograd Soviet of Labor and Defense. Chairman Zinoviev. To remain silent now is impossible, even criminal. Recent events impel us anarchists to speak out and to declare our attitude in the present situation. The spirit of ferment manifest among the workers and sailors is the result of causes that demand our serious attention. Cold and hunger had produced discontent, and the absence of any opportunity for discussion and criticism is forcing the workers and sailors to air their grievances in the open. White Guardist bands wish and may try to exploit this dissatisfaction in their own class interests. Hiding behind the workers and sailors, they throw out slogans of the Constituent Assembly of free trade and similar demands. We anarchists have long exposed the fiction of these slogans, and we declare to the whole world that we will fight with arms against any counter-revolutionary attempt in cooperation with all friends of the social revolution, hand in hand with the Bolsheviki. Concerning the conflict between the Soviet government and the workers and sailors, we hold that it must be settled not by force of arms, but by means of comradely agreement. Resorting to bloodshed on the part of the Soviet government will not, in the given situation, intimidate or quieten the workers. On the contrary, it will serve only to aggravate matters and will strengthen the hands of the Entente and of internal counter-revolution. More important still, the use of force by the workers' and peasants' government against workers and sailors will have a demoralizing effect upon the international revolutionary movement and will result in incalculable harm to the social revolution. Comrades Bolsheviki, bethink yourselves before it is too late. Do not play with fire. You are about to take a most serious and decisive step. We hereby submit to you the following proposition. Let a commission be selected to consist of 5 persons, inclusive of 2 anarchists. The commission is to go to Kronstadt to settle the dispute by peaceful means. In the given situation, this is the most radical method. It will be of international revolutionary significance. Signed, Alexander Berkman, Emma Goldman, Perkis, Petrovsky. Petrograd, March 5th, 1921. March 6th. Today, Kronstadt sent out by radio a statement of its position. It reads, Our cause is just. We stand for the power of Soviets, not parties. We stand for freely elected representatives of the laboring masses. The substitute Soviets manipulated by the Communist Party have always been deaf to our needs and demands. The only reply we have ever received was shooting. Comrades! They deliberately pervert the truth and resort to the most despicable defamation. In Kronstadt, the whole power is exclusively in the hands of the revolutionary sailors, soldiers, and workers, not with the counter-revolutionists led by some Kozlovsky, as the lying Moscow radio tries to make you believe. Do not delay, comrades. Join us. Get in touch with us. Demand admission to Kronstadt for your delegates. Only they will tell you the whole truth and expose the fiendish calumny about finished bread and Entente offers. Long live the revolutionary proletariat and the peasantry. Long live the power of freely elected Soviets. March 7th. Distant rumbling reaches my ears across the Nevsky. It sounds again, stronger and nearer, as if rolling toward me. All at once I realize that artillery is being fired. It is 6 p.m. Kronstadt has been attacked. Days of anguish and cannonading. My heart is numb with despair. Something has died within me. The people on the street look bowed with grief, bewildered. No one trusts themselves to speak. The thunder of heavy guns rends the air. March 17th. Kronstadt has fallen today. Thousands of sailors and workers lie dead in the streets. Summary execution of prisoners and hostages continues. March 18th. The victors are celebrating the anniversary of the Commune of 1871. Trotsky and Zinoviev denounce Thiers and Gallifet for the slaughter of the Paris rebels. End of Kronstadt, Chapter 38.
Chapter 39 of The Bolshevik Myth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman. Chapter 39. Last Links in the Chain. Pensively, Pushkin stands on his stone pedestal, viewing life flowing by on the square bearing his name. On the boulevard, the trees are smiling with budding green, and promenaders bask in the April sun, familiar sight of Moscow streets, yet with a strange new atmosphere about the people. The vision of Kronstadt had flashed across the city. Its dead embers lie ashen gray on the faces. I sense the disconsolate spirit in the procession of diverse type and attire, workmen in torn footgear, rags wrapped about their legs, students in black shirts belted at the waist, the tails fluttering in the breeze, peasants in lapti of woven straw, soldiers in long gray coats, and dark-skinned sons of the Caucasus in brighter colors. Young women mingle with them in short skirts and bare legs, some wearing men's boots. Most of them are painted, even the little girls. Boldly they gaze at the men, inviting them with their eyes. Gay music sounds from the garden nearby. At the little tables, white-aproned waiters serve food and drinks to the guests. Groups gather at the gate sullenly, watching the novel scene. Bourgeois, damned speculators, they mutter. The NEP is at work. Footnote: popular abbreviation of the New Economic Policy Re-establishing Capitalism, introduced by the 10th Congress of Soviets during the Kronstadt days. End footnote. All along the street, stores have been opened, their windows washed, freshly painted signs announcing private ownership. Provisions in large quantity and variety are exposed to view. Resentfully, men and women crowd on the sidewalk, their eyes devouring the tempting display. "No food for rations," someone comments sarcastically. "That's what we've been shedding our blood for," a soldier exclaims with an oath. On the corner, a feminine voice hails me. "Ah, the American Tovarish." It is Lena, my young acquaintance, of the raid of the Okotny market over a year ago. She looks very fragile, her paleness accentuated by her crimsoned lips. There is unwanted self-consciousness in her manner, and the pink mounts her face under my gaze. "You see, I didn't manage to get away," she says wearily. "Get away?" I asked in surprise. "Don't you remember? It was America, or—" She breaks off with a forced smile. We are in front of a sumptuous delicatessen store, men in starched shirts and white collars, looking offensively opulent, and elegantly dressed women carry their purchases with free, assured manner. Ragged children besiege them for alms. The passers-by scowl at them angrily. "How many times I was arrested for speculation," Lena remarks bitterly. Remembering my visit to her home, I inquire after her family. "Mother, baby, and Yasha died from typhus," she replies dully. "That's what the certificate said, but I know it was starvation." "Your cousin?" "Oh, she is doing well, with some communist. I'm all alone in the world now." "Poor Lena," escapes me. "Oh, I don't want your pity," she cries disconsolately. "Wish I'd died with Mother." Further, on the Tverskaya, I find Golas Truda, the anarchist publishing house, closed, a Tcheka seal on the lock. A man is peering through the window at the havoc wrought within by the raiders. His Red Army cap does not conceal the fresh scars on his head. With surprise, I recognize Stepan, my Petrograd soldier friend. He had been wounded in the Kronstadt campaign, he informs me. The Petrograd hospitals were crowded, and he was sent to Moscow. Now he has been discharged, but he is so weak he is barely able to walk. "We crossed the Neva at night," he relates, "all in white shrouds, like so many ghosts. You couldn't tell us from the snow on the frozen river. Some of the boys didn't want to advance." He looks at me significantly. "The communist detachment back of us trained machine guns on them. There was no hesitating. The artillery belched from our side. Some shots fell short, striking the ice just in front of us. In a flash, whole companies disappeared, guns and all, sunk into the deep. It was a frightful night." He pauses a moment. Then, bending close to me, he whispers, "In Kronstadt, I learned the truth. It's we who were the counter-revolutionists." The Universalist Club on the Tverskaya is deserted, its active members imprisoned since the Kronstadt events. Anarchists from various parts have been brought to the city and are now in the Butyrki and Taganka jails. In connection with the growing labor discontent, severe reprisals are taking place against the revolutionary element and the communist labor opposition, which demands industrial democracy. The situation handicaps the work of the Peter Kropotkin Memorial Committee, in the interests of which I have come to the capital. The Moscow Soviet passed a resolution to aid Golas Truda in the publication of the complete works of the great anarchist thinker, but the government closed the establishment. The Soviet also donated the house where Kropotkin was born as a home for the museum, but every attempt to get the place vacated by the communist organization now occupying it has failed. The official attitude negates all our efforts. April 15th. Unexpected visitors today. I sat in my room in the apartment of a private family in Leontievsky Alley when an official entered, accompanied by the house porter and 2 soldiers. He introduced himself as an agent of the newly organized Department for the Improvement of the Workers' Mode of Life, and I could not suppress a smile when he solemnly informed me that the campaign for the benefit of the proletarians is directed by the Tcheka. "Better quarters are to be put at the disposal of the toilers," he announced. "My room is among those to be requisitioned for that purpose. I should have to leave within 24 hours. In entire sympathy with his object, I called the official's attention to the utter impossibility of securing even bed space at such short notice. Permission and assignments must first be procured from the Housing Bureau, a procedure which at best takes a week's time. Often it requires months. Without deigning a reply, the Tchekist stepped into the hallway. Opening the first door at hand, he said curtly, "You can stay here in the meantime." A burst of soapy vapor swept against us. Through the clouds of steam I discerned a bedstead, a little table, and a woman bending over the washtub. "Tovarish, here lives," the house porter remarked timidly. "It's big enough for two," the official retorted. "But it's occupied by a woman," I protested. "You'll manage somehow," he laughed coarsely. Days spent at the offices of the Housing Bureau bring no results. But a week passes, then another, and no tenants appear to claim my room. The Department for the Improvement of the Workers' Mode of Life is apparently more interested in requisitioning occupied lodgings than in putting them at the disposal of the proletarians. Only influence in high places, or a generous gift, secures the favor. Footnote: several months later, the entire Moscow Housing Department, comprising several hundred agents and chief commissars, was arrested on charges of graft. End footnote. Unexpectedly, a friendly communist comes to the rescue. It is arranged that my room be assigned to the Kropotkin Memorial Commission for an office. Being the secretary, I am permitted to retain it as my living quarters. April 30th. Dark rumors circulate in the city. 300 politicals are said to have disappeared from the Butyrki prison, removed by force at night, it is reported, some executed. The Tcheka refuses information. Several days pass in tortuous uncertainty. Many of my friends are among the missing. People living in the neighborhood of the prison tell of frightful cries heard that night and sounds of desperate struggle. The authorities profess complete ignorance. Gradually, the facts begin to leak out. It has become known that the 1,500 non-politicals in the Butyrki had declared a hunger strike in protest against the unhygienic conditions. The cells were overcrowded and unspeakably filthy, the doors locked even by day, the toilet buckets seldom removed, poisoning the air with fetid smells. The Sanitary Commission had warned the administration of the imminent danger of an epidemic, but its recommendations were ignored. Then the strike broke out. On the fourth day, some of the prisoners became hysterical. Unearthly yells and the rattling of iron doors shook the prison for hours, the uproar rousing the neighborhood in alarm. The politicals did not participate in the demonstration. Segregated in a separate wing, they had, by collective action, compelled concessions. Their situation was much more tolerable than that of the common prisoners, but their sense of human kinship determined them to intercede. Their expostulations finally induced the Tcheka to declare the demands of the hunger strikers just and to promise immediate relief. Thereupon, the commoners terminated their protest, and the incident was apparently closed. But a few days later, on the night of April 25th, a detachment of soldiers and Tchekists suddenly appeared in the prison. One by one, the cells of the politicals were attacked, the men beaten, and the women dragged by their hair into the yard, most of them in their night clothes. Some of the victims, fearing they were being taken to execution, resisted. Butts of guns and revolvers silenced them. Overcome, they were forced into automobiles and taken to the railroad station. Investigation by the Moscow Soviet has now elicited the information that the kidnapped politicals, comprising Mensheviki, social revolutionists of the right and left, and anarchists, have been isolated in rigorous solitary in the most dreaded Tsarist prisons in Ryazan, Orlov, Yaroslavl, and Vladimir. June. Intensive preparations are being made for the reception of the foreign delegations. The Congress of the Comintern, Communist International, and First Conference of the Red Trade Unions are to be held simultaneously. The city is in holiday attire. Red flags and banners decorate official buildings and the residences of prominent Bolsheviki. The filth of months is carted off the streets. Swarms of child hucksters are being arrested. The beggars have disappeared from their customary haunts, and the Tverskaya is cleared of prostitutes. The main thoroughfares are emblazoned with revolutionary mottos, and colored posters illustrate the triumph of communism. In the Hotel Lux, palatial hostelry of the capital, are quartered the influential representatives of the foreign communist parties. The street in front is lined with automobiles. I recognize the Royce of Karakan and Zinoviev's machine from the garages of the Kremlin. Frequent tours are arranged to places of historic interest and Bolshevik meccas, always under the guidance of attendants and interpreters selected by the Tcheka. Within, there is an atmosphere of feverish activity. The brilliant banquet hall is crowded. The velvety cushions and bright foliage of the smoking room are restful to the delegates of the Western proletariat. On the sidewalk opposite the hotel, women and children lurk in the hallways. Furtively, they watch the soldiers unloading huge loaves of bread from a truck. A few chunks have fallen to the ground. The urchins dart under the wagon in a mad scramble. All traffic is suspended on the theater square. Soldiers in new uniforms and polished boots, and mounted troopers, form a double chain around the big square, completely cutting off access. Only holders of special cards, provided with photographs and properly attested, are permitted to pass to the big theater. The Congress of the Comintern is in session. July 4th. Polyglot speech fills my room far into the small hours of the morning. Delegates from distant lands call to discuss Russia and the Revolution. As in a dream, they vision the glory of revelation and are thrilled with admiration for the Bolsheviki. With glowing fervor, they dwell on the wondrous achievements of communism. Like a jagged scalpel, their naive faith tears at my heart, where bleeding lie my own high hopes, the hopes of my first days in Russia, deflowered and blighted by the ruthless hand of dictatorship. Most sanguine and confident are the latest arrivals, secluded in the atmosphere of the Lux and entirely unfamiliar with the life and thought of the people. Fascinated and awed, they marvel at the genius of the party and its amazing success. Tyranny and oppression in Russia are things of the past, they believe. The masses have become free for the first time in the annals of man. Ignorance and poverty, the evil heritage of czardom and long civil war, will soon be outlived, and plenty shall be the birthright of everyone in the land, where the disinherited have become the masters of life. Occasionally, in the discussion, a discordant note is sounded by the new economic policy. The seeming deflection from avowed principles is perplexing. Does it not hold the menace of returning capitalism? A smile of benevolent superiority waves the timid questioner aside. The NEP is ingenious camouflage, he is assured. It is of no particular significance. At most it is a temporary expedient, an economic Brest-Litovsk in a way, to be swept away at the first blast of revolution in the West. The more reflective among the delegates are disturbed. Life in revolutionary Russia is too reminiscent of home. Some are well-fed and well-clad, others hungry and in rags. The wage system continues, and all things can be bought and sold. Apologetically, almost guiltily, they express the apprehension that legalization of commerce might cultivate the psychology of the trader, which Lenin always insisted must be destroyed. But they are resentfully terrified when a Hindu visitor suggests that the Tcheka had apparently flogged the peasants into taking the whip into their own hands. Day by day, the problems of the revolution are discussed with increasing understanding of the causes responsible for the great deviation from the road entered upon in October 1917. But the pressing need of the present centers the greatest attention. Though syndicalists, we have joined the Third International, the Spanish delegate announces. We believe it the duty of all revolutionists to cooperate with the Bolsheviki at this critical period. They won't let us, one of the Russians replies. All can help in the economic reconstruction, the Spaniard urges. You think so? The visiting Petrograd worker demands. You've heard of the great strikes last winter, haven't you? The wood famine was the main cause of the trouble, and the communists themselves were responsible for it. How is that? A French delegate inquires. The usual Bolshevik methods. A man of proven organizing genius was at the head of the Petrograd Fuel Department. His name, never mind. He's an old revolutionist who spent 10 years in Schlüsselburg under the old regime. He kept the city supplied with wood and coal. He even organized a branch in Moscow for the same purpose. He surrounded himself with a staff of efficient men. Many of the American deportees were among them, and they succeeded where the government had previously failed. But one day, Dzerzhinsky got the notion that the fuel manager was permitted too much scope. The Moscow branch was liquidated, and in Petrograd a political commissar was placed over him, handicapping and interfering with his work. The famine was the result. But why? Why was it done? Several delegates exclaim. He was an anarchist. There must have been some misunderstanding, the Australian suggests. The policy of the communists throughout the country, the Russian says sadly. Friends, let us forget past mistakes, the Frenchman appeals. I'm sure closer contact can be brought about between the government and the revolutionary elements. I'll speak to Lenin about it. We in France see no reason for this strife. All revolutionists should work together with the Bolsheviki. Most of them are in prison, a former sailor remarks bitterly. I don't mean those who took up arms against the Republic, the Frenchman retorts. Counter-revolution like that of Kronstadt must be crushed, and— Don't repeat Bolshevik lies, the sailor interrupts vehemently. Kronstadt fought for free Soviets. I know only what I heard from communist comrades, the Frenchman continues, but I am convinced that all real revolutionists, like left SRs, anarchists, and syndicalists, should work together with the Communist Party. Almost all of them in prison, the Petrograd man repeats. Impossible, the Spanish delegate protests. The communists have assured me that only bandits and counter-revolutionists are in jail. A small, slender woman in a faded jacket hastily enters the room. She is greatly agitated and very pale. Comrades, she announces, the 13 anarchists in the Taganka have gone on a hunger strike. With trembling voice, she adds, It's to the death. July 9th. Opposition has developed at the Trade Union Congress against the domination of the Comintern. All important matters are first decided by the latter before being submitted to the labor men. The delegates resent the autocratic methods of the communist chairman. The inequitable distribution of votes is a source of constant friction. The Bolsheviki are charged with packing the Congress with delegates from countries having no industrial movement. An atmosphere of disillusionment and bitterness pervades the sessions. The French delegation threatens to bolt. Some of the Germans, Swedish, and Spanish members are perturbed by the general situation. They have come in contact with the actual conditions. They have sensed the spirit of popular discontent and caught a glimpse of the chasm between communist claims and the reality. The hunger strikes of the politicals in Moscow, Petrograd, and other cities have become a subject of great concern. The prisoners are undernourished and exhausted. The desperate decision jeopardizes their lives. It were criminal to permit such a tragedy. Moreover, it is felt that their protest is justified. In defiance of the Soviet Constitution, the politicals have been kept in prison for months, some even for years, without charges being brought against them. The foreign delegates propose to call the subject to the attention of the Congress. They will refuse to cooperate with the Bolsheviki, they assert, while their comrades remain in prison without cause. Fearing a serious rupture, some delegates secured an audience with Lenin. The latter declared that the government would not tolerate opposition. Hunger strikes cannot swerve it from its purpose, though all the politicals chose to starve to death. But he would agree to have the imprisoned anarchists deported from Russia, he said. The matter is to be immediately submitted to the Central Committee of the party. July 10th, 8th day of the Taganka hunger strike. The men very weak, most of them unable to walk, several have developed heart trouble. The young student, Shereshevsky, is dying from consumption. The Central Committee has taken action on Lenin's suggestion. A joint committee representing the government and the foreign delegates has been formed to arrange the conditions of release and deportation of the anarchists. But so far the conferences have brought no results. Dzerzhinsky and Unschlicht, now acting head of the Tcheka, claim there are no real anarchists in the prisons, just bandits, they declare. They have thrown the burden of proof upon the delegates by demanding that the latter submit a complete list of those to be released. The delegates feel that the matter is being sabotaged to gain time till the Trade Union Congress closes. July 13th. At last we succeeded in holding a session this evening. Trotsky was absent, his place taken by Lunacharsky as the representative of the party. The conference was held in the Kremlin. Unschlicht, a stocky young man, dark-featured and morose, in every gesture expressed his resentment of foreign interference in his sphere. He would not speak directly to the delegates, addressing himself only to Lunacharsky. His frank discourtesy unpleasantly affected the foreigners, and the conference was conducted in a formal, stiff manner. After much wrangling, the committee reached an agreement, as a result of which the following communication was sent to the prisoners. Comrades, in view of the fact that we have come to the conclusion that your hunger strike cannot accomplish your liberation, we hereby advise you to terminate it. At the same time, we inform you that definite proposals have been made to us by Comrade Lunacharsky in the name of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, to wit, 1. All anarchists held in the prisons of Russia, and who are now on a hunger strike, will be permitted to leave for any country they may choose. They will be supplied with passports and funds. 2. Concerning other imprisoned anarchists, or those out of prison, final action will be taken by the party tomorrow. It is the opinion of Comrade Lunacharsky that the decision in their case will be similar to the present one. 3. We have received the promise endorsed by Unschlicht that the families of the comrades to go abroad will be permitted to follow them if they so wish. For conspirative reasons, some time will have to elapse before this is done. 4. The comrades going abroad will be permitted 2 or 3 days at liberty before their departure to enable them to arrange their affairs. 5. They will not be allowed to return to Russia without the consent of the Soviet government. 6. Most of these conditions are contained in the letter received by this delegation from the Central Committee of the Communist Party, signed by Trotsky. 7. The foreign comrades have been authorized to see to it that these conditions are properly carried out. Signatures: Orlandi, Laval, Spain; Cirol, Michel, France; A. Shapiro, Russia. The above is correct, signed Lunacharsky. Kremlin, Moscow, July 13, 1921. Alexander Berkman declines to sign because A. He is opposed to deportation on principle. B. He considers the letter an arbitrary and unjustified curtailment of the original offer of the Central Committee, according to which all the anarchists were to be permitted to leave Russia. C. He demands more time at liberty for those to be released to enable them to recuperate before deportation. July 14th. The hunger protest was terminated last night. The prisoners are momentarily expecting to be freed, extremely weakened and in highly nervous state after 11 days of striking. Like a bombshell came Bukharin's attack upon the anarchists in the closing hour of the Trade Union Congress. Though not a delegate, he secured the platform and, in the name of the Communist Party, denounced the hunger strikers as counter-revolutionists. The whole anarchist movement of Russia, he declared, is criminal banditism waging warfare against the Soviet Republic. It is identical with Makhno and his povstanci, who are exterminating communists and fighting against the revolution. The session was thrown into an uproar. The majority of delegates resented this breach of faith in view of the tacit agreement to eliminate the matter from the Congress, but the chairman refused to permit a rejoinder, declaring the subject closed. A storm of indignation swept the House. The insistence of the Congress at last compelled a hearing, and a French delegate took the floor to reply to Bukharin's charges. In the name of the revolution, he solemnly protested against the sinister Machiavellian diplomacy of the Bolsheviki. To attack the opposition at the closing of the Congress without an opportunity of defense, he declared, was an act of perfidy unworthy of a revolutionary party. Its sole purpose was to prejudice the departing delegates against the revolutionary minority and justify continued political persecution, its obviously desired effect to annul the conciliatory efforts of the Joint Committee. August 10th. Days and weeks are passing. The politicals still remain in prison. The conferences of the Joint Committee have practically ceased. Rarely can the representatives of the government be induced to attend. The promises of Lenin and Lunacharsky are broken. The Tcheka has made the resolution of the Executive Committee of the party ineffective. The congresses are closed, and most of the delegates have departed. September 17th. At noon today, the hunger strikers were released from the Taganka 2 months after the government had pledged their liberation. The men look worn and old, withered by anguish and privation. They have been put under surveillance and forbidden to meet their comrades. It is said weeks will pass before opportunity will be given them to leave the country. They are not permitted to work, and they have no means of subsistence. Footnote: not until January 1922 were the released Taganka anarchists deported to Germany. End footnote. The Tcheka declares that no other politicals will be freed. Arrests of revolutionists are taking place throughout the country. September 30th. With bowed heart, I seek a familiar bench in the park. Here, little Fanya sat at my side. Her face was turned to the sun, her whole being radiant with idealism. Her silvery laughter rang with the joy of youth and life, but I trembled for her safety at every approaching step. "Do not fear," she kept reassuring me. "No one will know me in my peasant disguise." Now she is dead, executed yesterday by the Tcheka as a bandit. Footnote: Fanya Baron and Lev Chorny, anarchist poet and author, were executed with 8 other prisoners by the Moscow Tcheka in September 1921. End footnote. Gray are the passing days. One by one the embers of hope have died out. Terror and despotism have crushed the life born in October. The slogans of the revolution are forsworn, its ideals stifled in the blood of the people. The breath of yesterday is dooming millions to death. The shadow of today hangs like a black pall over the country. Dictatorship is trampling the masses underfoot. The revolution is dead. Its spirit cries in the wilderness. High time the truth about the Bolsheviki were told. The whited sepulchre must be unmasked, the clay feet of the fetish beguiling the international proletariat to fatal will-o'-the-wisps exposed. The Bolshevik myth must be destroyed. I have decided to leave Russia. End of chapter 39. Read by Eli Bishop, San Francisco, March 26, 2022. End of The Bolshevik Myth by Alexander Berkman.